This is our final thing. What we had just looked at, just a quick reminder, we know that John Wilson was apprehended. He was interrogated. He chose to create a statement, which is filled with some lies. For the most part, there's some truths in there, but he's manipulated some of the facts. And we also know that he, at some point, does attempt suicide, and he does survive the ordeal. He does regret the ordeal, but it was an attempt. How this man doesn't die, I don't know, with all the stuff that like goes through. He just keeps defying the odds. So we're going to finish up the book, though. So starting off, chapter 36. This is on page 150 of your novel, and it is read all about it. So the last line we saw in the last chapter was that then on November 13th, 1919, the newspapers broke the story. Ooh. So read all about it. So November 13th, 1919, the Saskatoon Daily Star reported that sensational murder case is suspected. Police closely searching country near Borden Ferry for woman's body. John Wilson tries suicide. Believed that he had killed his wife and married another 2 days later, John Wilson is lying at death's door in Regina General Hospital, having slashed his own throat. And police are making a close search for the body of Mary, who is Polly Wilson, who died in an automobile September 27th, 1918, according to her husband's statement. Wilson is charged with attempted suicide. Police believe the body of his dead wife must be somewhere in the vicinity of the Borden Ferry. Mary out of the way, John Wilson married Jessie Patterson of Blaine Lake 2 days later. So the facts have come out and the facts are public. Now, this seems like a pretty sensational story, right? Just the whole fact that it's a murder, he tried committing suicide, like he's an RCMP officer, there's all this mystique around it. So the public goes wild. The public began a love affair with the John Wilson murder case. It was a sensation, no other word for it. Newspapers flew off the stands and out of the hands of paperboys. In every cafe, street corner, and around every supper table was the talk of Sergeant John Wilson and the poor woman who came all the way up from Scotland, only to end up in an unmarked grave somewhere out there. It was the love triangle, and the fact that John Wilson was a policeman, that made it so irresistible. And then 2 days later, he married the other woman. So this is where we get the title of the novel from, right? It's Secret Lives. He has 2 different lives of Sergeant John Wilson. It's a true story of love and murder. On the day the story broke, Commissioner Perry wrote to Elizabeth Craig in Scotland. He described in detail the events that eventually led up to Wilson's arrest and attempted suicide. And then he went on. I regret to inform you that the suspicions against John Wilson in connection with the disappearance of his wife, Mary Wilson, are now very grave indeed. In his written statement, John Wilson states that his wife, Mary Wilson, died in his car, in which he took her out in the country after her arrival at Saskatoon. It is with the deepest regret that I have to advise you of from the facts as disclosed by our exhaustive investigations and the statement of Wilson that your sister, Mary Wilson, apparently met her death at his hands on September 27th, 1918. I might state that so far Wilson has not given any details regarding the crime. Neither has he yet disclosed what disposition was made of the body. So they are convinced that he murdered her. They know when he murdered her. They know that he murdered her somewhere in this vehicle while he was driving, but they don't know how he did it, and they don't know where the body is. Please accept my deepest sympathies for yourself and Mrs. Wilson's family in this sad affair. I should like to assure you that every possible effort is being made to ascertain the exact details and place the guilt for this crime upon the party responsible, after which no effort will be spared to bring him justice. To get the news to the family sooner, the next day, Commissioner Perry sent the following cable. That way it would go basically instantaneously. Wilson states the wife died on November 1918. He's held on charge of murder and attempted suicide. So he sent that as a letter. That letter takes time to get there. In the meantime, he sent that short cable. He can't send a really long cable. They're very expensive at the time. The date of the death given as November was an error on someone's part and would cause probably even more confusion and grief in Polly's family. We know that she had died in September. Now, there were not only Royal Northwest Mounted police officers everywhere, but there were also SPP officers investigating the disappearance of Mary Wilson. That's the Saskatchewan Provincial Police, of which has made a comeback, I think a year ago was when it researched. under the astute guidance of Charles Augustus Mahoney, had in just 2 years become a highly respected police force. Charles Mahoney was very much his own man, an inspector of criminal investigation for the Ontario Provincial Police. He preferred to work in plainclothes and resigned when uniforms became mandatory. A strong liberal and Roman Catholic, he could not be swayed by influential politicians, was fair in his dealings, and was able to enforce discipline without using an iron hand. Many ex-Mounties, on returning from the war, chose to join its ranks rather than return to the Royal Northwest Mounted Police. The SPP's uniform was a long khaki tunic, better than the Mounties' bum freezer, they said, with a high military collar, khaki breeches with a red stripe down the side, brown boots and leggings, and brown Stetson hat with a brim turned up on the left side, similar to the South African bushman's hat. Officers wore peaked caps and lapel collar tunics. If you ever want to like just throw up one of their uniforms, like on Google, it's kind of interesting. I won't do it, but feel free to, if you can find it. Mahoney knew his hastily organized force lacked the flair of its counterparts, with no spirited bands, musical rides, public relations men, famous red-coated uniforms, and no glowing reports in the press. Without any of these trappings, their reputation for quiet efficiency steadily grew. Compared to the Mounties, life in the SPP was informal. Members saluted their officers and members of legislature, but as one SPP veteran put it, one salute would do. Officers were easily available to the men. The same veteran said you could talk to your officers in the provincial police, discuss things with them. But Charles Mahoney insisted on one thing. As soon as they received word of a crime, they were to investigate while clues were hot. In the case of Mary Wilson Misson, the clues were almost 14 months old. The first joint investigation took place on November 14th. Detective Drysdale teamed up with Sergeant Sparkman of the SPP and James Martin, a civilian, and they drove to the culvert. If you remember this name, this Martin guy, he had worked under Wilson in the military police and accompanied him to the burned car after his wedding. At Rosthern, the two policemen interviewed Isaac Neufeld. That's the farmer who first saw Wilson on the morning of 28th, 1918, that like when he showed up and started puking everywhere. Neufeld told them in detail everything that happened from the time Wilson arrived in his house at 5:30 a.m. asking for a drink of water. His description of the murder scene supported Martin's. The culvert is in a hollow. There is some brush nearby. The grass was about 1.5 feet high in the culvert. So we see that consistent story still. James Martin made neat pencil diagrams of the road, the slough, the culvert, and the car from 2 vantage points. They are elegant, detailed drawings, and reports includes the beautifully handwritten notes of Sergeant Drysdale. I don't think we see these drawings, though. Next, they interviewed John Neufeld, who recounted his memories of that morning in detail, going over much the same story as Isaac with 1 or 2 additions. He also had a new shovel with him. He gave it to me when I drove him to Blaine Lake. I have it now. He said he carried it because he sometimes got in the sand. Under the culvert, there was some dirt, and the man shoveled some of this onto his car. He looked pretty sick and white. He vomited in my yard. He did not talk very much on the way up to Blaine Lake. He borrowed a top coat for the ride. So the story is consistent with all 3 witnesses. This guy just adds the extra details about the shovel. John Neufeld produced the shovel with a Ashdown hardware label still on it. Henry Williams confirmed the absence of geese in the burning car and told them Isaac Peters had taken a picture of the car later that day. The police returned to Saskatoon with photos of the burned car to the delight of the newspaper reporters. Drysdale was at first skeptical that a car leaving the grade at that point would land on its wheels. It seems to me that the chances of 1 car in 100 performing the same feat again would be very slight indeed. But after a thorough examination of the area, Drysdale concluded his report to Inspector James with the following observations. Before leaving, we felt satisfied that there was nothing in place which caused the search. And in view of the other circumstances which had become known to us beforehand, the zigzag tracks leading over the grade, his extreme nervousness and nausea, these considerations led us to believe that he must have arrived at that spot shortly before and that he actually had the accident. Unless something is learned in the meantime, it would appear that a house-to-house search is necessary through the district between Saskatoon and the scene of the accident for obvious reasons. So basically he's like, yeah, it seems like he actually crashed. Like that's basically what he's saying there. From the facts contained in this report, there is every indication that Wilson buried the body someplace before the accident to the car happened. John Wilson had done a good job of drawing attention away from the culvert. By now, members of the military police, the Royal Northwest Mounted Police, and the Saskatchewan provincial police had walked over, around, and through the culvert right over Polly Wilson's shallow grave. A few days after their joint patrol, Sergeant Sparkman returned to the site and took 4 snapshots, including one of himself standing by the culvert to show the approximate height of the culvert, which he measured at 4 feet 6 inches. Its width at 6 feet 4 inches. So all like he got quite lucky here, like with his car. They think that it happened before the accident. They think the reason he was in this accident was because he was really nervous and he had killed his wife at that point. When what we know, the reader, is that no, where he had the accident is where he did it. He killed her, buried her, and then immediately went straight into that culvert and had the accident. So the Saskatoon Daily Star, November 14th, 1919, the trial to be held in Saskatoon. A mystery so baffling and a crime so dastardly that its only parallel in modern criminal annals is the famous Dr. Crippen case, which is now being investigated by the provincial police. Police think that the body of Mrs. Wilson was either burned in the car or thrown in a slough. Sergeant Wilson was brought back under escort from Vancouver when relatives of his former wife wrote that the woman had not heard from for 14 months. While they pleaded with the authorities to ascertain why their daughter did not write, she was lying dead in an unnamed grave, while her former husband deceived a trusting girl whom he married within a few hours of this first wife's death. The large Eastern dailies also jumped on the story. Believe man did away with first wife to marry second, shrilled the Montreal Daily Star. Murder suspect tried to end life. And the Saskatoon Daily Star posed these questions. Did Sergeant Wilson of the police burn the body of his first wife, Mary Wilson, when he destroyed the automobile? Or did he kill the woman and later burn the car to obliterate traces of the murder? Or did he kill her at all? Sergeant Wilson came back to Saskatoon without his overcoat. Did he burn the overcoat because there were bloodstains on the garment? The hunt for this woman's body is gradually narrowed down. The residents of the district are urged to be on the lookout for an unidentified grave. The newspaper accounts encouraged avid readers to try and solve the mystery, and armchair detectives abounded. Some went further. Armed with shovels, they combed the countryside around Blaine Lake and Waldheim and points along the road between there and Saskatoon, looking for the grave of that poor soul who came all the way from Scotland. People couldn't get enough of it. On November 17th, the Daily Star published the photograph of Polly Wilson and her 2 children. That's the one that we saw, like somewhere like page 80 or something. Polly's abundant shining hair was piled up in the style at the time, and a slight smile supported her lips. Her large, clear eyes, and those of the children, were intently fixed on a spot somewhere to the right. Below this picture was the picture of the burned gray Dort. The next day, the Star added another human interest element. Jesse Patterson, who Wilson married the day after the disappearance of his first wife, is at Blaine Lake, Saskatchewan. She will become a mother about the end of this year. So she is pregnant. So Jesse Patterson is pregnant. She will become a mother at the end of this year. And in the meantime, the authorities are not questioning her. She is believed to be entirely innocent of any knowledge of the alleged murder, and police are humanely leaving her to herself until Wilson's child is born. Questioning at this stage might seriously affect the health. And so remember, she will become a mother at about the end of this year. So at this point, she is about 8 months pregnant at this point. Now, and what we do know is that, in fact, at this time, Jesse was barely 4 months pregnant. So we know that John Wilson did all this because he really loved Jesse. And now, of course, Jesse's getting caught in the crossfire. So chapter 37, blood-stained love letters. Before Jesse went home to Blaine Lake, the police had confiscated the Wilsons' 2 trunks and left them in the room where Jack and Jesse had stayed. The unlocked trunk held only clothes and a few household items. The other was locked and its key lost or taken home by Jesse. At the Grand Hotel, Provincial Police Assistant Superintendent William Tracy, a tall, lean Scot with a sharp mind and a dour sense of humor, watched as Sergeant Corby tried and discarded key after key, finally shaking his head and standing up. It's no good with any of these, sir. All right, Sergeant, round up some more keys, and if we have to, we'll break the lock. Constable Scottney, in a room at Blaine Lake Hotel, stood up as Jessie entered the room, gripping her father's arm. She appeared unwell and pale, but she walked erect and looked Constable Scottney in the eye. He pulled a chair for her. Please sit down, Mrs. Wilson. You too, Mr. Patterson. That's Jesse's father. They sat with Scottney at a small table facing them. I realize this is very difficult for you, ma'am. It won't take long. That's good. Jessie is in a very, she can't take much more right now, John Patterson said. I understand. I merely wanted to ask you, Mrs. Wilson, if you know where we might locate your husband's shotgun. She shook her head. I don't know where it is. He lent it to an inspector in Vancouver to go duck shooting. When was that? Do you remember? Just this fall sometime. And do you know his name? No, I don't. There was a trace of anger in her voice. At what or whom Constable Scotney could not tell, perhaps at the circumstances. Thank you, Mrs. Wilson. I appreciate your coming down. John Patterson stayed behind a moment. Jessie will answer questions later. It's just she's very delicate right now. Her mother or I have to be with her at all times. Conrad Reed's statement arrived on Commissioner Perry's desk. It was startling in its revelation that Wilson had told him that he and Jessie would be married on the evening of September 27th. Reed recounted the episode of the missing Colt pistol, which he later found in Wilson's desk, and then the shotgun. I first saw the 12-gauge shotgun in the office of John Wilson in the armory in Saskatoon. Wilson invariably took the shotgun with him when making a trip into the country with this car. It kicked around in the bottom of the car about as much as it did in the office, or rather in the bottom of the car that was burned. Also, the car that replaced the one which was burned. And so Reed begins to describe cleaning the gun when it was left at its place. I am satisfied I should know the gun again. He writes a detailed description of the gun. We saw this in the pawn shop, the model of it, the leather case, the initials, all that stuff. The maker was Parker of Edinburgh, so it's that Scottish shotgun. I know nothing of Wilson's home affairs, but I believe from remarks that he had made from time to time that his mother and father were both dead, that he had lost a sister in France during the war. Lie. Not very long ago, he had lost his only other sister, Lie, who died in Scotland, and then he had a brother in England who had been made prisoner by the Germans, Lie, but had escaped in the fall of 1918, also a lie, and who stood small chance of recovery from his wounds. Reed's statement points up Wilson's tendency to lie when he wanted something and to fabricate stories about his tragic siblings. Wilson's tendency to lie when he wanted something. We saw this on the second page of the book. To fabricate stories about his tragic siblings, who were in reality all alive and well back in Scotland and had not heard a word from Jack since 1914. Wilson, still at the police hospital, improved daily, and the police planned to move him to Regina jail at the end of the week. Men from the SPP combed through the rubbish at Corey Nuisance Ground for the remains of the burned car. The newspapers duly reported. The rubbish heaps in the Corey Nuisance Ground yielded broken, flame-scarred parts, which were identified as belonging to Wilson's car. But what the police were really looking for, the portion of the tonneau wall which a bullet is believed to have penetrated, had not been discovered at press time. And an SPP constable spent day after day showing Wilson's photograph at every hardware store and general store in Wilson's large territory in hopes that a clerk would say, I know that man, he bought a shovel here. And keep in mind here, Wilson, he's very noticeable, right? He's really tall, he's really thin, he's really pale, he's always nervous when he goes to these stores and stuff like that. So he stands out. Plus, sometimes he wears his red coat. So back at the Grand Hotel, the 7th key was tried and clicked. It worked. Sergeant Corby smiled up at the assistant superintendent Tracy. Lucky 7, he said, and lifting the lid, carefully opened Wilson's trunk all the way back. On the left side of the tray lay a brown leather dispatch bag, filthy, scorched, and covered with blood. Good God, breathed Bill Tracy as he hunkered his long frame down for a closer look. Does that look like blood to you? I would say so, sir. They looked at each other and smiled. So up until this point, so that they're not going to find her body. As long as they don't find the weapon he murdered her with, he probably could get away with this. You need to still be able to prove it. This is 100 years ago. Had he been smarter, and he himself said this yesterday, where maybe I shouldn't have kept his letters. If I wouldn't have kept this blood-soaked stuff, if he would have gone about this better, could have said she died in the Spanish flu, he probably would have gotten away with it, even if the cops pulled him in to investigate. So it's due to his carelessness here later on in the story where he's going to eventually get found out. Does this look like blood to you? I would say so, sir. And let's have a look inside. Carefully, he undid the straps and lifted the flap. Tracy whistled at the sight. Thick, crusted blood had stuck the scorched flap and straps to the case. The marks showing that the bag had been opened long after the blood dried were clearly visible in a thick, dark outline. And here we have some physical evidence of blood and flame and time. I think we just have found our murder witness, Sergeant. He said, you'd better take notes as I examine the contents. Yes, sir, Sergeant Corby. Corby produced a notebook and a pen and pulled up a chair to the open trunk. Tracy reached for a large blue envelope in the inside pocket of the case. It had been stuck to the leather at one point. The front of the envelope and its contents liberally stained with what appeared to be blood. Tracy drew out the contents, all military police papers, a copy of the Military Service Act of 1917, a quantity of forms used in enforcing it, its copies of reports submitted by Wilson, circular descriptions of persons wanted under the MSA, which is the Military Service Act, and other papers. And he looked at each paper, he identified it to Sergeant Corby, who listed it. Tracy then opened another pocket in the bag, also stained inside, and spread the contents of a large, bulky envelope onto the hotel room floor. They were obviously personal letters, most of them addressed to Jesse Patterson in Blaine Lake and Prince Albert, and some addressed from Jesse to Wilson in Regina, Saskatoon, and other places. So he kept his letters. Tracy pulled the letters and laid them down in their envelopes. My dearest Jessie, dearest wee girl, my darling Jessie. There were a lot of them, some in Wilson's handwriting and some typed on an office typewriter. Most were from Wilson to Jessie, with hers to him much more restrained in salutation. Dear Jack, or one, dearest Jack. So this is why when we've read this book, we see all these letters. This is how we get these letters, is he physically kept them. So these are the actual letters. A quantity of personal letters, Tracy dictated, his voice barely able to contain his excitement, from Jack Wilson to Jesse Patterson and vice versa, covering a period from, he scanned the letters, the early part of 1917 until their marriage in late September 1918. So now we have some evidence that a murder took place, that there was a fire, there was dried blood, time had accumulated, and now we have some motive. We have some proof of reasoning with him. Many of the letters were also stained with the same substance which at some time oozed into the openings of the case and onto the letters. We'll submit these to Dr. Charlton tomorrow. C.M. Charlton was the coroner and provincial analyst. If it's human blood, Wilson's going to have to think of something besides a finger cut. Remember, it is drenched in blood. He's going to blame the goose. That's what he's going to blame, right? That's why he was trying to shoot stuff. Or the duck or whatever it was he was hunting. Should I say, let's hope it is? Might as well say it as think it, said Tracy, and I'd lay money on whose it is. No takers, Sergeant Corby said, but why would he hang on to it? That's what I'd like to know. Tracy lifted the tray and saw quantities of ladies' clothes, blankets, a coffee pot, and other household articles, all neatly packed. He felt that through them without disturbing the neat contents too much. His wife must have seen it. It looked as if she packed the trunk. How the devil would he explain the condition of the place? Anyone would think it was blood. He must have concocted some story, sir. Yes, Wilson is quick with a story, and it was duck hunting time. He might have said he'd thrown some duck or geese on top of it. Possibly, and it seems as if she believed everything he said, both before and after they were married. Tracy began returning the letters to the envelopes. I'll read these at the offices, he said. He gathered at the letter he'd just picked up. Listen to this. So like this blood here, right? So this has only happened a month and a half after the actual murder itself. This is not long after the fact. Listen to this, Sergeant. I am almost a free man now, dearest. Just a few more days. I may have been married and had to get a divorce, but thank God, even if I am no Christian, I can look back on a miserable life and say I never harmed a miserable girl in my life. What an honorable man, our sergeant. This quote here. I would recommend put a sticky note here. This is usually a really common one that people reference to when writing about this. I would recommend put a little sticky note to this. I've never harmed a miserable girl in my life. We know that he is in fact harmed too. What an honorable man, our Sergeant Wilson. And look at the way he signs his letters. Your honest, faithful, and true Jack boy. We've talked about those. Tracy picked up one after another, his voice incredulous and amused. Your loving, kind, and true Jack boy. And listen to this. Your honest, clean, and true Jack. At this, both men burst out laughing because everyone knows, that's the opposite of what John Wilson is. Clean too? Well, how could she resist him? How could she believe him, you mean? Well, she was young, wasn't she? Very young and very gullible. Poor girl. Which is right. Both wives he's had have been extremely gullible. Poor first wife, I say. Yes, indeed, both of them. Tracy was scanning through some of the letters. Well, we've got him by the short hairs, I think, with these. He talks about marrying this girl in just about every letter, most of them written before his wife conveniently died. So we see the plan starting to form. He gathered up the letters, carefully replacing them in their correspondent envelopes. Charles Augustus will be most interested to read these, he said with a delighted grin. These last two are letters to Jesse from someone else. This one signed, your dying sister, Mary. Good heavens. And one from some minister in the old country. I'll have a look at them later. Tracy returned the papers to the case. So again, one from some minister in the old country. We've seen that letter. Shall I list the other things in the trunk? I don't think we need to now. We can do that later. There aren't any more papers or photographs that I could see. So they're convinced at this point, like they view this as like enough evidence. Sergeant Corby locked the trunk again before leaving the hotel room, and back in his office, he read Wilson's 2 forged letters to Jesse. The one signed, your dying sister, Mary, the signature was so shaky, it was difficult to read. Tracy shook his head several times while reading the letter. Little did Wilson know, when making references to the Glasgow holiday and other details with the letter would be read by a sharp-minded Scot with 6 years' experience with the Burge of Patrick Police in Scotland. Remember, like a lot of these policemen came from Scotland and UK and stuff. We've seen a couple Scottish police now. They're familiar with a lot of these like differences in cultures and languages and stuff like that. After reading the minister's letters to Jesse, he sat deep in thought for a time and scrawled a few lines onto a page and tossed the letters into his in-tray. He rolled a legal-sized sheet of paper into his typewriter and began his report to the commissioner. It will be seen that the above letters cover a period commencing in the early part of 1917 until the date of the marriage in 1918. But I noticed that in the letters dated May 1918, Wilson apparently becomes madly infatuated with Miss Patterson and declares that it is impossible for him to live without her. I also draw your attention to the fact that Mary Wilson arrived in Saskatoon in April of 1918, and immediately Wilson redoubled his efforts to gain the hand of Jesse Patterson. And again, if you remember, this is quoting here, Wilson himself said that when his old wife came to the country, that he immediately gave up the prospect of Jesse, but we know his actions proved otherwise. We see that again. We know his actions proved otherwise. I found 2 typewritten letters alleged to be written in the Royal Infirmary in Glasgow, Scotland. One of these letters is supposed to be written by Wilson's sister, who at the time of writing is supposed to be dying. The writer then goes on to tell Jesse about her brother John's previous marriage, making particular reference to the unfaithfulness of his first wife, and ends by commending Jesse to his care and hopes that they will be happy together. And remember, anyone who has ever said anything about Polly Wilson has always said that she was like a really good and caring person, right? So they use that testimony from all these people to be like, no, this is clearly a lie. This appears to be a rather peculiar statement for a dying girl to make, as she apparently gives her sanction to her beloved brother committing the crime of bigamy. You will also note that, speaking of the wedding preparations, she states that they cost John several $1,000s. In my experience, it is very rarely that the old people speak of dollars when speaking of money. They always refer to pounds, right? So one of those like key things there that kind of pop up. You don't notice it at first. The second letter, evidently a minister who also appears to be in possession of the particulars regarding the previous marriage of Wilson and his unhappy marriage with his first wife. The writer commends Miss Patterson to the care of Wilson and prays for the future and prays for their future happiness. He also gives his sanction to the crime of bigamy being committed, which, to say the least, is a most unusual thing for a minister of this gospel to do. There is no mention of Wilson having obtained a divorce from his first wife. Old country divorces are much more easily obtained than in Canada. And if as stated, Mary Wilson was of an immoral character, I'm of the opinion that it would have been an easy decree for him to have obtained a decree of divorce. That this was not done is evident by Mrs. Wilson's arrival in Regina in April in 1918. So he's like, I lived there. I know what it's like there. You're lying. Another point which strikes me as peculiar is the reference to Wilson meeting Mary Hutchinson during the Glasgow holiday and marrying her 10 months later. To my knowledge, the pleasure boats on the River Clyde do not commence until the beginning of June and what is known as the Glasgow Fair Holidays. So remember, in his fake letter where, this devil bastard of a wife, it was said that she was basically like, she roped him in on these pleasure boats. And he's like, well, the pleasure boats don't run then. The The pleasure boats on the River Clyde do not commence till the beginning of June, and what is known as the Glasgow Fair holidays are an annual event, always held from the 10th to the 20th of July, which would put the date of his wedding sometime between March or April of 1918. But since he was married on New Year's Day 1908, I'm of the opinion that the story in this letter is a false one. In a joint patrol on November 21st, Sergeant Drysdale and SPP officers Smith and Sergeant Sparkman drove to Blaine Lake to interview the threshermen once more. As Inspector Smith had not seen the site of the burned car, they drove first to the culvert. The zigzag tracks made by Wilson's car were still visible. The three examined the bushes around the site and those on the way to Isaac Neufeld's, where Wilson had gone for water that morning. A filled-in hole covered with broken branches caused some excitement, but they dug down to sand and clay without result. They again examined the well in the slough. Then calling at first one farm and then another, they talked to the men who had been there that day. They found Henry Funk out in his shop, oiling a piece of machinery secured in a vise. He waved them to sit wherever they could and carried on with his work. We were first at the machine that morning, Isaac Peters and I. I was running the machine, and it was dark yet, around 5 o'clock. I heard a car going north, traveling real fast with no lights. That would be before 6 o'clock. Then I saw a big smoke go up. Henry waved the oil can, spraying oil in all directions. A big white smoke, and after that, a black smoke. A few more drops flew up, but by then the other boys were there, and I said, "That's gasoline burning. Let's go down and have a look." So, basically, this is a farmer who, at one point, like just noticed the car driving past, like while Wilson was committing the act. When Smith asked Henry about Wilson's action in the car, he laughed. That guy was drunk. He'd been sick everywhere, and he was acting kind of queer. And in this case, like remember, this is 100 years ago. They're saying odd, like he's acting kind of odd. In what way? Oh, he told different fellows different stories about how the car got there, and he kept going back and forth, getting dirt from under the culvert and throwing it on the car. I guess he was doing it just to do something, but he seemed to be in a daze. So this is the second time that they see reference to him digging, like putting dirt on the car. Next, they went to see Isaac Peters. They sat around the kitchen table, and Mrs. Peters poured them coffee. Then she discreetly withdrew to another part of the house. Peters told them the same story about seeing a car and then smoke. It was just getting light, and I could see one person in it, and then we saw the smoke. Some of the boys got on the elevator to look. The elevator? Sergeant Sparkman asked. Yes, on the threshing machine. And then they saw a big car burning. And then there was no car down there when Henry and I passed over the culvert going to work. When asked about Wilson, Peters laughed. That man wasn't sober. He looked like he'd been dragged through a knothole backwards. And he told some funny stories, too, that he had geese in the car that burned and so forth. But we would have smelled them. I figured he concocted a story about the car catching fire before he went over the grade in case somebody asked us. It was a police car he burned up, and he was driving awful damned fast with no lights. So again, he said he had these geese in here. We know he shot a geese, but he didn't retrieve it. And they would have smelt it. They would have smelt the burned feathers and stuff like that. There would have been some evidence of it. At John Neufeld's farm, they talked to John and Agnes Neufeld, 17 years old next March, who had been in the back seat when her father drove Wilson to Blaine Lake. Drysdale asked if she remembered the drive. Oh yes, the four of us were in the back seat. There was a yellow straw vasile on the floor with bright red spatters on it. I asked the man, Wilson, if it was blood, and he took it in the front with him and said it was from the geese. Did he say anything else? I don't think so. He seemed kind of mad that we asked him. John Neufeld also remembered Wilson being annoyed that children had noticed the spots. He again told Wilson about Wilson borrowing his coat for the ride and giving him the shovel that he had no more use for when he got out at Blaine Lake. They also talked to Nicholas Bold, another of the threshers. Detective Sergeant Sparkman, SPP, commented in his report, it will be particularly noticed that Nicholas Bolt says that Wilson had an overcoat on. He thinks a slicker of a lighter color. This latter should be noted as subsequent investigations showed that Wilson was supposed to have burned his coat, according to his own statement, and that he borrowed a dark coat from John Neufeld to go to Blaine Lake. The question remained, when did he do away with his coat? So Sparkman concludes his report on the patrol. From the above, it appears established as the fact that Wilson arrived at the spot where the car was burned at about 5:30 and that the fire was simultaneous. It would now seem certain that the fire was the direct result of the car going over the grade. and that going over was an accident. From all these circumstances, it now appears clear that Wilson would have had no time to do much or any digging in the vicinity where the car burned. And it necessarily follows that the body of Mrs. Wilson is not in the immediate vicinity. This is now beyond conjecture. And again, what we know happened here is he pulled into the side, killed her, buried the body, and then when he escaped, he crashed. It will also be noted that apparently Wilson was traveling without headlights, although the time was too dark to do so. This may have been that he was wishing to attract as little attention as possible along the road. This also strengthens the theory that the accident and the burn-in was not intentional. Also, the story that Wilson filled the car at Saskatoon early in the morning cannot be substantiated and was no doubt only said to establish the story that he was at Saskatoon overnight on the 27th, when he was no doubt in the old country at some point. Disposing of his first wife. So chapter 38, new players. One by one, Jack encountered the new players in the drama he had set in motion that night by the culvert. Superintendent Bill Tracy visited him at the Mounted Police Hospital and pulled out the 2 forged letters to Jesse. Tracy told him the reasons he knew they were forged and that he'd already sent them to the Stirling Chim Police for confirmation. So this is back in the interrogation with Jack, right? Do you admit you forged these letters, Jack? Yes. For what purpose? He refused to answer that. He wasn't going to tell them anything they didn't already know, especially where he'd put Polly. The next day, Tracy and Inspector Smith took him out of the hospital to the SPP headquarters and into the office of Inspector Goldman. Goldman was a small man with a mustache and brown gold-rimmed glasses. Wilson had heard of him. He was a Boer War veteran and reputed to be sharp as they come. So this was a war that happened before World War I, by the way. Wilson stood in front of Goldsmith's desk. Tracy was seated to the left of Goldsmith. Smith stood against the wall behind him. Facing them all like that, Jack felt his legs go weak and shaky. Then he noticed the large manila envelope on Goldsmith's desk and recognized it from Jesse's trunk. Goldsmith just looked at him for some time. The inspector's beady eyes looked right through him, and his right eyebrow soared up as if he wouldn't believe a word anyone said. Finally, he spoke. Has your memory improved regarding what happened to your wife, Mary Wilson? No, I don't know what happened to her. And why don't you know? My mind is in a haze. Surely you remember that she died? No, yes, I remember she died, but I don't know how. Goldsmith picked up the envelope and emptied its contents on the desk. Photographs of Jack and Jesse in Blaine Lake and Prince Albert. Jesse in her nurse's uniform. Jesse in her new car. Jesse and him separately on the trip west. 2 of them with Con and Nell. Jesse and Nell laughing on the beach at English Bay. Goldsmith dropped the photograph of Polly on the 2 children on top of the pile. Is this a photograph of your first wife, Mary Wilson? Yes. And where did you bury her body? He didn't answer. We've got all day, Wilson. I can't remember. Do you remember where she died? No, somewhere on the way to Blaine Lake. How close to Blaine Lake? I don't know. I don't know how it happened or where it happened. I wrote it all in my statement, and that's all I know. Are those your children with your wife in the photograph? Goldsmith asked. Yes. For their sake, don't you think that you should tell them where their mother's buried? Inspector Smith said. Silence. Outside the window on Goldsmith's right, dry snowflakes eddied and swirled from a leaden sky. A sudden gust of wind rattled the window, a cold, mournful sound. Again, that's one of the few landscape references there. What about the rest of the family, Jack? Tracy asked. Her mother and father are ill now, and this terrible thing is making it harder for them. At least let them arrange a decent burial for their daughter. He just clamped his lips together. They'd never make him tell. As long as they didn't have a body, they couldn't charge him with murder. Well, he just said that like he buried her body and she died. Think of the mother of your children, Wilson, lying out in the cold ground in some lonely place. He just shook his head. Good Lord, he thought. What kind of awful story were they going to come up with next? Then they changed tactics. Did you know Jesse is ill? Tracy asked. No. He felt the color drain from his face. She is very ill. This is all very hard on her, you know. Tears sprang into his eyes. He couldn't help it. She didn't lose the baby, did she? He steadied himself with the edge of the desk. No, she hasn't lost the baby, but she could if this goes on much longer. The doctors are very worried about her condition. She's very, very ill, Goldsmith said. He couldn't stand it anymore. I won't tell you anything until you let me see Jesse. Then Then you do remember where you buried your wife? Goldsmith said. I won't say anything about it till I see Jessie. I need to tell her myself. So again, he's just like, he doesn't think straight when it comes to Jessie. That's their in. They've changed their tactic and they found it. They found some leverage. Goldsmith leaned back in his chair and looked at Wilson, impaled him, it felt like, with his small piercing eyes. He made a pyramid with his short fingers. Well, Mr. Wilson, I can't see that talking to you is going to make her feel any better. I understand you are being transferred to the Regina jail. We will bring you here 2 hours each day until your memory returns. Now, good day to you. He began to gather up the snapshots from the desk. Jack wanted to ask for one of the photos of Jessie, but he didn't. He could hardly walk down the corridors. His legs felt like rubber and perspiration slid down his ribs. Tracy opened the outside door and motioned him through. As the cold wind hit him, he shook like a leaf from head to foot. On their way to the car, they met Superintendent Mahoney. He was dressed in plain clothes, a handsome bald man with even features and intelligent eyes, a man you'd notice anywhere. Mahoney looked Wilson over, then he and Tracy walked away a few paces and talked in low voices for a few minutes. Once, at something Tracy said, Mahoney flashed a smile, and Jack could see why his men were so fond of him. Why hadn't things worked out for him? He could have been a superintendent himself one day. He felt relieved to be back in his jail cell. It was peaceful and it was warm. That evening, Tracy, Smith, and Goldsmith fielded various theories regarding where and how Wilson had hidden his body. They were in Tracy's office drinking coffee, all relaxed in chairs now. An ashtray on the desk was slowly filling with cigarettes and cigar ash. He could have buried her anywhere from Saskatoon and Blaine Lake, or maybe he just said that to put us off. It could be past Blaine Lake or God knows where. It's like looking for a needle in a haystack. Do you suppose he might have put the body in a haystack and set fire to it? It's possible he wouldn't be the first to do that. And there'd be lots of them around after harvest. I could go up there and look if there were any suspicious or malicious fires around that time. Good idea, Tracy said. When can you leave? Tomorrow morning? Smith said without much hope. Tracy grinned. Tonight. Smith glanced at the clock on the wall. Yes, sir, I'll catch the late train. Smith and Goldsmith left Tracy's office, and as they walked down the hall, they heard the typewriter's keys clattering behind Tracy's door. They looked at each other and shook their heads. It was 11 o'clock. So he's right in he's still working, 11 p.m. In his report to Mahoney, I'm of the opinion Wilson has made up his mind that unless the police are successful in locating the office, they will not be in a position to place a charge of murder against him. The accused appears to feel his position very deeply, and when mention is made of Jessie Patterson, he appears to be on the verge of a breakdown. When the name of Polly Wilson and her people is mentioned, the accused does not appear to take it to heart and shows an utter disregard for any of his or Polly Wilson's relatives in Scotland. I am of the opinion that if the accused will ever divulge the secret of where Polly Wilson's body to be found, it will be through Jessie Patterson or her people. But Tracy also knew that Jessie might be in a hurry to see her husband charged with murder, especially if he had told her after he was arrested that was an accident. I trust you, husband, she had said when she came to see him in the guard room. And if Jessie's family did not pressure Jack to tell the truth and get over with it, what then? So they don't want him to see Jessie because Jessie is so freaking gullible that if he sees her, they're worried they might lose their leverage. This is their only way in, is Jessie. So chapter 39, a soulless scoundrel. When the second cable came telling them that Polly had died at Wilson's hands the previous November, Elizabeth and Archie Craig went back to Slamanan to break the news. Since Polly's mother had been so upset at the news of Wilson's remarriage, they decided to show the cable to Elizabeth's father first. William Hutchinson was shocked at the accusation, but not surprised to know that Polly was dead. He already knew it in his heart. But I can't believe that Jack took Polly's life. He'd been false and untruthful, but never would he do such a thing to Polly. I won't believe that of him. And remember, when he left, I think that was 1912, he was really faithful. He was a really good dad, right? His only real mistake was stealing money from the business. But he was a really good husband at that time. Which is why he's like, I can't believe he actually did it. Oh, I pray you're right, Father. And Polly died a natural death, said Elizabeth. Maybe she died in an accident? Archie shook his head. I think we should prepare for the worst. The police have said as much. Police have as much said so, haven't they? But what will you say to Mother? Elizabeth cried. It would kill her to think that Polly's life may have been taken from her. We have to tell her that we've lost Polly, William said, but not what they suspect. So not that we think that she's been murdered. But it will be in all the newspapers. How can we keep it from her? We must try to keep it out of the papers. Everyone around here knows the family, Archie said. Oh God, what did he? So it's spreading worldwide, but like it's a sensational story. So that they're worried it's going to spread even all the way over there. Oh God, what did he do to her? If he harmed her, did he give her a decent burial? I wonder. This had been on Elizabeth's mind since the cable arrived. Perhaps she's not really gone. I dreamed I saw her sitting with a baby in lawn clothes on her knees in a bare log cabin, and Jack entered a lawn passage. As soon as he came near, Polly wept bitterly. Elizabeth wept as she told it. I asked her what was wrong, and she said something about bread. That dream had left such a vivid impression it worried me for weeks, like a warning I could do nothing about. Do you think he might have been put her in some out of the way place? I doubt that, Lizzie, William said gently. I think we must accept that we've lost Polly. But if he married in September and the cable said she died in November, where was she for those 2 months? Remember, the cable mistakenly said November. So that's what's causing this confusion. You know how she would grieve at his abandoning her in a strange land. She must have spent 2 sore months somewhere. William Hutchinson shook his head. I'll never understand how he could forget those bairns. Any father would be proud of them. And their beautiful house, Elizabeth said, just the way she left it. She didn't wipe away the tears that ran down her cheeks. They had almost become natural to her. Her father just shook his head. I ought to write to the commissioner, but I've tried more than once and I cannot. Nor can I, said Elizabeth. James will reply, I'm sure. And Polly's brother did on December 10th, conveying the family's gratitude for the commissioner for handling the case. Unlike his sister Elizabeth, James Hutchinson was nothing if not direct. At the end of his short letter, he wrote, my intimate relations with Wilson date from March 1909, and I found him to be a liar, a rogue, and a soulless scoundrel. Remember, this is who he stole the money from. Commissioner Perry had advised the family on December 8th that Polly's body had not yet been found, but that the police were sparing no efforts in trying to locate it. His letters to the family were unfailingly kind and sympathetic. Elizabeth wrote again, detailing Jack's treatment of Polly. She loved him and could see no wrong in him, and it was not for us to wound her by showing her his falseness. As a girl, she was like a wee fairy. She was so thin, with a mass of long golden curls. She was always brave and would have laughed at what would have made me weep, and it seemed like she needed all her bravery. She told a teacher friend that she would lay down her life for her husband if it would let him get on in the world. She always thought he would come back and take his place in the nursery again, for he had left a beautiful home here. It is still sad as my sister left it. Oh, isn't it all very sad? Now in finishing, I hope again he is not guilty. It makes me so sad to think that the children's father is in prison. They wouldn't let him rest. They hounded and hounded him. No sooner were the provincial police finished than the Mounties came at him. What'd you do with your shotgun, they asked. I sold it in Vancouver. When was that? About 6 weeks ago. To whom did you sell it? I don't know his name. Where does he live? I don't know. I was never at his home. Where did you meet him? I don't remember. And then Tracy and Goldsmith had another round with him at the dispatch case. Did you hide the case from your wife, Jessie? No. Then how did you explain the presence of so much blood on it? I told her it was oil. Wasn't she suspicious? No, she trusted me. Goldsmith cast his eyes to the ceiling. They wanted to know about the car, how it caught fire, what caused the accident, where he was going, and so on. What didn't they want to know? That's what he'd like to know. He was afraid to open his eyes in the morning in case there'd be a policeman standing by his bed. So they are interrogating the ever-living crap out of him. From the wording before and after the crossed out words in Wilson's statements, it was thought that the hidden words were a reference to the burial site. The provincial police tried everything to decipher them. They first photographed the document, hoping this might enlarge the erasure. It didn't. And also in case the original document became damaged by tests. They took the original document to Dr. Manning, a chemistry expert at the University of Saskatoon, which is U of S now, to see if the iodine vapor test would work. Dr. Manning held out no hope for separating the original words from the applied lead of the cross note, both consistent of the same material. They subjected the original to much magnifying and microscopic testing. They lifted a considerable portion of the erasing pencil with candle grease, heat, and friction, but still they couldn't read the underlying words. They x-rayed it. They even had it projected onto the screen at a motion picture house. The words kept their secret. On December 8th, 1919, a letter for John Wilson was forwarded to Charles Mahoney. On December 10th, Superintendent Mahoney had the letter delivered to John Wilson. The next day, there was a break in the case. So now we're on chapter 40. This L here is like the Roman numeral symbol for 50. So it's 10 before 50, it's 40. What page are you guys on in your book? What page are we on right now in your guys' book? 170? Okay. Like I said, we have a lot of reading to do. We're going to try and finish it. On December 11th, Bill Tracy received a phone call from the Regina jail. Wilson wanted to make another statement. Tracy didn't give him his time to change his mind. When Tracy arrived at the jail, Wilson told his story. He had met Polly's train and they had stopped at the Cairns store before heading out into the country and stopping to shoot some geese. He said that he had shot some geese and returned to the car. She, who is Polly, went over to the right-hand side. I actually, this letter, I just want to quickly talk about that. So this is the letter that he had received. And then Wilson makes another statement, and this is the break in the case. So this is his letter. This is his statement. So he's saying that Polly went to the right side of the car, got in her seat. I went and looked at the radiator, and then I came back to my own side of the car. And just as I was opening the door to go in the car, my right foot slipped, and I remember her saying, "Watch Jack." And watch Jay. I think it was Jack she was going to say. That was just when I was putting my right hand up to catch the side of the car. But that was the hand I had the gun in. When the gun went off, I remember shouting something, "My God, Polly." So he's saying, "Oh yeah, I shot her. It was an accident." I saw that she was hit in the head here, pointing to his right temple. I don't remember exactly what I had done. I went over to the left side, put my arm around her and shouted and shouted. And then I ran around and jumped in the car and started the car up. And after it was going, I steered with the left hand and had my right arm around her, holding her, shouting to her all the time. And I knew she was dead anyway. Winston told about driving wildly to within sight of Saskatoon, then decided to turn around and go to Dr. Langlois in Marcelin. The lights burned out along the way and the car jumped the grade. When the car landed, with the jolt of the car hitting the ground, she fell. I was still holding her, but she fell out of the door of the right-hand car. I went clean off my head altogether. Then I don't know how long I was around there, nor anything, nor what I was doing. The first thing I remember clear after that, I was sitting in the grass beside her. She was lying on her back on the grass, and her feet were on the running board of the car. I sat there thinking for a while, wondering what I could do now. Then I figured out that no one would believe this story I told, that it was an accident or anything else. So I went into the back of the car and I got a shovel. I dug her a grave under the culvert. It was daylight then, and there was a car passed overhead with fishermen in it. And they passed over when I was still working. Then I went back and looked at the car, and there was quite a bit of blood in the front seat, and I took the satchel out and set fire in the front seat of the car. And quite a few threshers came down. And while I was going into Blaine Lake in the car and all day Saturday, I thought about going away, but I did not. Jesse and I were married Sunday night in Saskatoon. It seemed so funny. The fate seemed to go against me at the time. At first, after the first thing when she came to the old country, I did not know she was coming here. I was in Prince Albert one day trying to enlist in the military police overseas draft. I was talking to the superintendent when she phoned him from Regina asking where I was. That was the first time I had been in that office for nearly a year, and if I had not been there that day, he would have sent her to Blaine Lake to me. And then again that night, when we were going to Blaine Lake, I would tell Jesse everything. She knew all about Jesse. Then the accident happened, and even then, my intentions were good. Just about 2 or 3 weeks before I left Vancouver, I took the gun down to a second-hand store on Cordova Street, Vancouver. When you leave the CPR, you come onto Cordova, then you swing to the left and come to a bunch of second-hand stores. All the secondhand stores are bunched together in there. I think it is a Jewish woman who is in there. She will have it on her returns. I gave my right name to her. The suitcase that Mrs. Wilson had was just a cheap wicker suitcase and did not wear no time. I have her rings. I was intending to keep them for the little boy. I think I have them in the trunks. There were just 2 rings, one marriage ring, and there's a diamond in the engagement ring. I think she would have had her purse with her. I did not look to see if she had. I put the robe of the car around the body. I put the body into the culvert on the right from the right-hand side. It is not buried very deep. The head was put in first from that side next to the car. That's all I have to say. There's nothing else. The only thing I wish to say is that this statement is made voluntarily, and no inducements or promises have been held out to me for the same. This statement is made to Assistant Superintendent Tracy of the Saskatchewan Provincial Police in Regina. So the reason he makes this statement is because of this letter he got in that last chapter. So the letter Wilson received on December 10th had apparently changed his mind. If the police were right, it was from Jesse or Jesse's family on her behalf. In any case, the wait was finally over. He described Polly's suitcase as just a cheap wicker suitcase and did not wear no time. Polly must have given him the expensive leather suitcase, her farewell gift from Elizabeth or Archie, or he borrowed it when he left for Saskatoon. She probably thought the handsome leather case was more appropriate to his position than hers. And on the evening of December 11th, Sergeant Drysdale received a call from SPP inspector that Wilson had told him where he'd buried the body. Bright and early on December 10th, Smith, Drysdale, and Sackman drove to the culvert armed with picks, axes, and shovels. With 2 local men from the district, a team of horses with stone boats standing by, they began to dig in the frozen ground. And we see the pictures of this, like 30 pages back. We see the pictures of them actually digging.
So this is what he's saying that this is all an accident.
Yeah. So he's telling them where the body is now. Yeah. So basically, he's now convinced, oh crap, they found all this stuff. They could probably pin it on me now, even without the body. So this might be his way of trying to get out of this. Like, it was an accident, and I'll cooperate with you. Here was the body. About a foot down, they came to a pair of ladies' boots set at a 45-degree angle. The boots had bones in them and decomposed flesh. They worked until dark and then continued the following morning. The body was buried about 4 feet deep at the hips. 4 feet deep, like that. Like, if you've ever dug a hole, that's a long way to dig, right? Clothing was pulled up over the knees, and the torso and head wrapped in a coarse blanket. The body appeared to have been thrown in an oddly shaped grave, with no care taken to straighten the limbs. The body was removed along with much frozen soil. After photographs were taken of the body from all angles and of the excavator, coroner C.M. Charlton ordered the body removed to Saskatoon. The news that the body had been found in the culvert must have come as a shock to both police forces, since the investigators had been so thoroughly ruled out the culvert as a burial site, right? Like they would have never found this body. The avid followers of the case must have pounced on that, and the fact that it was right beside the car. To many, it seemed incomprehensible that the investigators had consistently turned a blind eye to the culvert. Their conviction, however, was based on the 2 statements that the grass was about 1.5 feet high in the culvert the day the car burned, right? When you dig a grave, you can't just put the grass back on it. So that's why they assumed this. And on Drysdale's unequivocal assertion, the ground under the culvert was, after the fire, known to be covered with growing grass and weeds, and she cannot be buried there. And Detective Sergeant Sparkman, SPP, had concluded that the accident had just happened, giving Wilson no time to do any digging in that vicinity. This is now beyond conjecture, Sparkman had concluded in his report. Before beginning to dig Polly's grave, Wilson must have sliced off the top layer of soil, including plant roots, and returned it to when he was finished. The following summer, the grass and weeds grew again. Still, if the culvert was overgrown with grass and weeds, how did they account for the loose dirt he took from under the culvert to throw in the car? Detective Sergeant Drysdale was one of the many who gave a lot of thought about the chronology, the timeline of events the day of the murder. And the reason they hadn't suspected the body was right there. His report to Commissioner Perry, dealing with the recovery of the body, the postmortem, and the inquest, ended with these comments. The perusal again of the statements taken in this case shows in the main that several persons arrived at a car within 10 to 15 minutes of the time the smoke was seen. And taken into consideration that the 2 people saw a car going north and saw the smoke shortly afterwards, I cannot understand how Wilson could have been at the culvert as long as he states he was. I have read his last statement, and above all, to have time to remove traces so well, I am strongly of the opinion now that the body was recovered from under the culvert, that at the time of the accident, it was his second appearance at the place. It was actually his third. On the first, he killed Polly. On the second, he buried her. And on the last, he accidentally went over the bank while fleeing the scene. So basically, he's saying there was, like, to do this and like no traces would take so long and so much work. Like there's no way. There's no way. The evidence as to using of the shovel, the brand new shovel, by Wilson at the car suggested, and it was understood as if he was merely thrown on a little dirt haphazardly, like the futile action of any other man having come over the grade as he had done. The other question, the most puzzling of all, is why did Wilson, after leaving the site, drive off the road exactly there, almost pointing to the grave? He was driving fast with no lights, as if trying not to be seen, and probably on his way to the Blaine Lake. The police eventually concluded that he went over the spot accidentally, an uncanny coincidence. On the morning of December 15th, Dr. Charlton held the post-mortem. So it's the autopsy. Tracy and Goldsmith picked up Wilson and drove downtown. Wilson wondered why they didn't tell him where they were going, but he didn't give them the satisfaction of asking. At a building he didn't recognize, they went in and down some stairs. The heavy door whooshed open, and the smell of formaldehyde and decay hit him. He saw several large steel cabinets, a large sink, and lawn enamel-topped cupboards. And on top of the middle of the room, a white draped figure. Oh God, no. He turned and tried to get out of there, but they were too fast for him. With a firm hand on either arm, they walked into the table and the white-coated man standing there. This is Dr. Charlton, Tracy said. Jack Wilson. Dr. Charlton, this is the guy doing the autopsy, nodded briefly, then pulled back to his sheet to expose the gray car rug still wrapped around Polly's head and shoulders. Do you recognize this blanket? It was stained dark with blood, and dirt clung to the rough fabric everywhere. I don't. There are lots. It looks like the one I wrapped her in. Thank you. He folded back the blanket and pulled the sheet away from the rest of the body. Wilson gagged and turned away. Take a good look, Jack, Inspector Goldman said, and they made him look again. Do you recognize this clothing as that of your wife, Mary Wilson? Yes, it's an old country tweed she had. He was worried he said too much. Do you recognize this body as that of your wife, Mary Wilson? Asked the coroner. Yes, his voice was faint. What did you say? Asked Dr. Charlton. Yes, that's her. It seemed to Jack that the coroner took longer than he needed before he pulled up the sheet. The whole experience was horrible, and he said later that the police had no business to take him there with no warning and confront him with such an awful sight. Goldsmith took Wilson out, and Tracy stayed for the post-mortem. Dr. Charlton gave notes to an assistant as he proceeded. If you've ever read, has anyone here ever read like a coroner's notes before? It's like extremely detailed. They use very scientific language. At this point in time, there would be a little bit less of that, but so length of the body, 5'3", the head turned to the right side. The body is clothed in what appears to be a woman's costume. Head and upper part of the trunk is rolled up by a lap rug. Body as a whole is in a bad state of decomposition, and it's going to go into a bunch of detail talking about that decomposition. The feet are enclosed in laced shoes, medium height. The welt of the shoe is a brown lip, toe of show gray swad, heels, French heels. Blue serge coat with belt, blue silk lining, remains of a corsage pinned to the left shoulder of the suit coat. Under the coat, a white silk blouse buttoned down the front and fastened with a brooch at the neck appears to be a gold brooch, pearls and rubies, with one ruby hanging from center as a pendant. Blue serge skirt to match the coat. Skirt is buttoned with dome fasteners down front and left of center. The blouse is flowered, silk collar trimmed with lace at the front of the neck, silk camisole buttoned down front, name of maker on blouse, Delaird. Next, a cotton embouchure, and then we come to a corset with a safety pin on left breast at top, under corsets, a cotton envelope undergarment stained with blood, and the body is disclosed. The skull is badly shattered, found against a fragment of skull, a pellet of shot, flattened against it. The features are indistinct. The upper portion of the skull is missing, some of it from roughly a line from the face under the eyes over the top of the skull to a line drawn round the head to the lower lobe of the ears. The skull in between these lines is shattered into numerous pieces, the largest being 5 inches by nearly 3 inches, and it was inside of the largest fragment that the pellet was found. So like her head got blown off, right? This shot was fired at close enough range that most of the charge went through. Gas of charge has exploded inside. The forehead and dome of the skull is missing. No fragment of thin orbital plate. Under portion of the orbit is gone. On the skin of the right side of nose, there are 3 black marks suggested of powder marks. In the right hand, in the right hand pocket of suit coat, some papers were found which looked like the sewing pattern. Piece of cotton wool found on the left side overcoat, no pocket or name tag in skirt. Woman is pregnant of male child, 12.5 inches long, about 6 months old. Woman has a good, healthy heart, body drained of blood. Lungs healthy, liver healthy, stomach empty except for fragments of red apple skins. Stomach healthy, intestines normal, kidneys normal. A further examination of the head showed a piece of bone down the neck at the back. Shotgun pellets found in the collar of the coat on the right side. 2 more pellets were found at the scalp. A piece of straw was found in the hair. The hair was done up by 6 tortoise shell pins and 2 smidges of hair found among the natural hair. Deceased wore white silk stockings fastened by hose and porters to corsets. The coroner's inquest was opened by Dr. Desrosiers at McQuagg's undertaking rooms at 9:15 that night. Dr. Charlton was the only witness called. He gave evidence of his findings and stated that, in his opinion, the deceased came to her death from the gunshot wounds in the head. Obviously, right? Like her head's gone. The inquest was until 4 p.m. December 22nd. Back once again at the Grand Hotel, Bill Tracy, accompanied by Corporal Shard, searched Wilson's trunks, looking for a jeweler's receipt for the purchases of Jesse's engagement ring. Polly Wilson's engagement ring was missing, and if there was no receipt, perhaps he had given the ring to Jesse. By now, the police had decided they would put nothing past like Jack Wilson, right? And isn't that just like a scoundrel thing? Like you shoot your wife, steal the ring off her finger, and give it to another person. Like that's kind of that's what they've now figured out. Is like, oh, that's what he did. A careful search produced no receipts, but it produced something much more bizarre. In the bottom of the second trunk lay a folded waterproof overcoat, apparently Wilson's, with both sleeves tied shut at the shoulder with a stout string of sailor's knot. What in Sam Hill is this? Tracy said. It looks like the coat has been submerged in water, doesn't it, sir? It has been. Look at that stain and the watermarks on it. He peered at it closely. Hard to tell if all these stains are from water or something else he was trying to soak out. But why tie up the sleeves? Wilson could tell us, but he won't. My guess is he used it for something at the time of the murder. Tracy held it out. Tied like this, it becomes a makeshift receptacle, doesn't it? Good Lord, why wouldn't he just get rid of it? He's a Scot, said Tracy and laughed. The police were intrigued by the coat. The lab verified it was blood Wilson tried to soak out, but why did he tie the sleeve shut? According to the autopsy, many pieces of Polly Wilson's skull were missing and not found in the grave or at the site. So remember that autopsy, like the reason it was put in this book was kind of show like there's pieces of skull everywhere. Perhaps the overcoat was used as a receptacle, a basket for anything Wilson missed burying in the dark. Or he may have even used it to drag Polly's body to the gravesite, or both. They concluded that he had tied the armholes shut while soaking it in an effort to keep it submerged in water. Both the blood-soaked dispatch case and topcoat could have appeared secretive in the straw suitcase Wilson took with him. They would become exhibits at Wilson's trial. Bill Tracy's crime report to Charles Mahoney regarding the coat was also sent to Inspector Prime, Royal Northwest Mounted Police, the Deputy Attorney General, the agent of the Attorney General, Inspector Smith, SPP, the Inspector Tate, and Prince Albert. Things are getting complicated. On December 16th, Commissioner Perry advised the Royal Northwest Mounted Police Comptroller that a charge of murder would be laid against Wilson. So they are now officially saying you murdered her and we believe we have enough evidence to convict you. They don't charge you unless they think they can convict you. So these next chapters should move pretty quick. So chapter 41, buried by strangers. Things move quickly in Vancouver. 2 agents talked to Miss Scissors in her shop at Cordova Street about a man who sold her a hammerless Scottish make-figure shotgun on October 4th. The description fit Wilson to a T. So we now know that the guy who sold the shotgun was, in fact, Wilson. They believed it to be Wilson's handwritings. They visited Mr. Much, who was reluctant to part with his gun. Murder trial or no murder trial, police or no police, but eventually was persuaded because it was a pretty good gun. Commissioner Perry arranged for the weapon to be transported from Vancouver to Regina by an SPP non-commissioned officer. James Hutchinson called Superintendent Mahoney, requesting that a layer be purchased and that his sister be given a Christian burial and all expenses sent to him. Sympathetic members of St. Andrew's Society, which is a Scottish society, most of them, Presbyterian church members, purchased a casket. They held a small funeral service and stood respectfully as the minister committed Polly Wilson's body to its final rest. They also wrote letters of sympathy and Christian's comfort to Polly's family. So basically, they fundraised a wedding or a funeral. Brutally murdered by the man she loved, Polly Wilson was finally buried by strangers in a strange land. Jim Hutchinson, incensed that Wilson should add insult to grievous injury by trying to blacken Polly's reputation, sent six letters attesting to his character's upstanding, generous character. He's responded to that fake letter. Jim's succinct letters, with the nice touch of irony when referring to Wilson, must have been a welcome change from Elizabeth's tragic, impassioned epistles. He had this to say about the Magdalen letter from dying Sister Mary, extolling Wilson's sterling virtues. Keep in mind that the fact he invested all of the money his parents left him in glass houses, that he was good to the poor people, erected a monument, and chartered a pleasure streamer, it would be difficult to understand where the several $1,000s for his wedding expenses came from. I note with considerable satisfaction from the minister's letter that Mary did not have time to tell the half of what the poor boy suffered. Elizabeth sent the letter telling how good Polly had been to John's old uncle, the joiner, and how his relations said he might think much of herself, as they never thought he would have given his stuffed box away. He had prized it so much. The Reverend Alan Reed of Slamanan Parish Church, who had married John and Polly, wrote that he had known Polly from childhood to womanhood, so all her life. She was successfully SS scholar, junior Bible class treasurer, and collector for church objects in my congregation. I have never known nor heard of anything in her character or conduct that invited the least breath of criticism or suspicion. Her life in our midst was a blameless one. Her disposition was sweet and amiable. She was liked and trusted by everyone who knew her. Cheerfulness, good temper, and good humor were so much of a part of her nature that it would be difficult to imagine that she could bring anything but peaceableness and concord into relationships of the home she formed. We, myself, and for those whom I can speak, are deeply grieved to think that not only could she have met so untimely an end, but that the attempt should have been made to cast a shadow on her memory. So he sends a bunch of letters being like, nope, John Wilson's lying. She's like upstanding character. The inquest resumed on December 22nd, 1919 in the Saskatoon courthouse, with Philip Mackenzie representing the Crown. Wilson was present, a livid scar on his throat standing out against his pale skin. Mackenzie laid before him the statement he wrote in the guardroom. Did you make this statement, Mr. Wilson? Wilson stared into space. Is that your signature here on this last page? And the defendant refused to answer. Bill Tracy testified that on December 11th, Wilson phoned to say he wished to make a voluntary statement to reveal the whereabouts of Mary Wilson's body. Is this a statement you gave to Assistant Superintendent Tracy and Inspector Smith? Mackenzie asked, laying the document before Wilson, of which Wilson did not reply. Inspector Smith testified to the discovery of the body in the place it was alleged to be, and that Wilson had identified the clothing as that worn by his wife at the time of her death, and no further evidence was taken. The jury was out for a short time and returned with a verdict that Mary Wilson came to her death in the PM of September 27th, 1918, that Mary Wilson came to her death between Saskatoon and Rosthern, that Mary Wilson came to her death from a shot in the head fired at close range from a double-barreled shotguns in the hands of John Wilson. So a lot of those like random chapters now go on to show it's like we have the evidence to prove all of these things. So chapter 42, a struggling mass of humanity. No one was prepared for it. Not the police, the legal counsel, the court officials, or John Wilson. This was, after all, not a murder trial, but a preliminary hearing to determine if there was enough evidence for a trial. But there they were, outside the courthouse, hundreds of curious citizens, their breath pluming in the frozen air. This is basically Christmas, right? December, well, not this December, but most December's cold as hell out. Their breath plume in the freezing air in a queue that wound on and on. They had begun lining up hours before. When the doors opened at 9 o'clock, the crowd surged forward, breaking rope and cordons and jamming corridors, stairways, and every available inch of standing room. Many were unable to get in at all. The Saskatoon Daily Star called it a struggling mass of humanity, intent on seeing John Wilson, alleged wife murderer. Saskatoon was not to see another scene to compare with it until the 1985 trial of Colin Thatcher for the same crime, murdering his wife. Judge C. Johnson and Crown Prosecutor P.E. Mackenzie arrived and struggled through the crowd like salmon swimming upstream. Please, please, pleaded a flustered court official, make room for the magistrates to get through. The courtroom was far too small to accommodate the several hundred spectators, and after a hurried consultation, it was announced that the hearing would be adjourned to the Masonic Temple across the street. The spectators were rushed to a temple, a large two-story building where even the large assembly room in the basement proved too small to hold them all. There were many women in the crowd, and some, like the men, stood on chairs in the back of the hall, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of Wilson. An excited murmur went through the crowd as Wilson was led into the impromptu courtroom. His face was deathly pale, his hair long and disheveled, but he walked unassisted and answered the few questions they would put to him with cheerful alacrity. He seemed fit, and his attitude represented a 180-degree turn from his behavior at the inquest. When the court adjourned for the luncheon, he trotted back to his cell through a back lane with a guard hurrying beside him. After lunch, the crowd was larger. The Daily Star reported that those who were there in the morning came back after lunch and brought their wives and families. When court resumed, the jammed courtroom heard from Isaac and John Neufeld about the events on the morning of September 28th, 1918. 2 photos of the burned car, proved of great value to the police, were exhibited and identified by Isaac Peters. "Why did you take the pictures?" Mackenzie asked. "It was the first accident we had seen, and we wanted a picture," Isaac replied, and the spectators laughed. Mrs. Wismer, that's Eileen, statement that Polly was 6 months pregnant when she left Regina brought a murmur from the spectators. She also asked about Polly's finding Jesse's letter and leaving for Saskatoon to meet her husband. Miss Wismer explained that she had heard nothing from her since. Assistant Superintendent Tracy testified to Wilson's 2 statements and attempted suicide. Sergeants Drysdale and Sergeant Sparkman described finding the body. The pictures of the body at the burial site were shown, almost unrecognizable as human remains because of the large amount of frozen earth excavated. Then Dr. Charlton, the coroner, testified. "And how, in your opinion, did the deceased, Mary Wilson, come to her death?" said Prosecutor Mackenzie. "She was killed by a shotgun blast which entered above the right eye and blew off the top of her head," Dr. Charlton replied. The crowd gasped and a low buzz of talk erupted. Order was called, and Mackenzie then rested the inquiry. "The prisoner will please stand," said the judge. Wilson almost leapt to his feet. "John Wilson, the charge against you is that on September 27th, 1918, you did deliberately and with malice aforethought murder your wife, Mary Wilson, by a shotgun blast to the head. How do you plead? Not guilty. Do you have legal counsel, Mr. Wilson? No, I do not, and I don't want any. Do you wish to make any statement? No, your worship," Wilson replied. Magistrate Johnson then committed Wilson to stand trial at the next court of the incompetent jurisdiction, the Federal Court of King's Bench. He was to be remanded to the Prince Albert Jail until judge. No one offered bail, and Wilson did not request it. So remember, this is not the trial. This is like being like, can we go through with the trial? Is there some evidence to kind of like do this? So like there's hundreds of people that are like looking at this. This is not even the trial. Like it's really hard to like emphasize how like this is like the royal wedding at the time. Like everyone was so infatuated with it. The next day, Wilson found himself on a familiar ride, the train bound for Prince Albert. He was accompanied this time by Inspector Smith. How many times had he ridden this train on business to be with Jessie that spring of 1918, with their love so new, intense, and wondrous? How many times had she sat across from him or close beside him so he was so proud to have her there. Now all was changed. Now winter lay over everything, but at least he was going to Prince Albert. That much was closer to her. They had promised to transfer him to the Prince Albert jail immediately if he told them where Polly was buried. They had promised at the same time to keep it out of the papers for Jessie's sake and to arrange a meeting with her. All lies. So now he remember, he's been in jail for like the last I don't know, like month and a half, something like that. Like he doesn't know what's going on in the world. He doesn't know that this has become like a giant spectacle. But still, now that he'd be so close away from the commotion in Saskatoon, surely she would come to see him. Surely she didn't hate him. He couldn't bear that. Through the train windows and worlds, the world went on as before. Men laughing and loading freight at every station. Station agents and trainmen going about their businesses. Passengers being met at each little town, bundled children on sleighs. When the train stopped at Blaine Lake, his heart surged as he caught sight of John Patterson's livery barn, Jessie's house, the streets they'd walked so many times together. He crossed the aisle and sat on the other side, his eyes closed. Eventually, the train started up again. Someone had left yesterday's Daily Star on the seat, and he read the account of his preliminary hearing. What a shock that had been. All those people. The paper's front page carried a story about the Treaty of Versailles. The omission of America's signature stands from the bitter disappointment of the hope that glowed with promise a year ago, he read. The article might have been talking about him. The Treaty of Versailles is what ended the First World War. On January 29th, 1920, Elizabeth wrote to Commissioner Perry on black bordered stationery to thank him for his kindness for his family. She couldn't read his or Superintendent Mahoney's letter herself, she said. Her husband had to read them to her, and she was sure he left out the worst. Miss A. Wilson Fullwood, which is a cousin of Jack Wilson's, wants me to draw your attention to a matter in Wilson's last confession, namely that he says my sister's ring had 1 stone. Now it was a 5-stone diamond ring, his engagement ring to her. His marriage ring was not very broad, but thick through and heavy. She had a beautiful pendant and necklace and brooch in the form of spray of flowers composed of pearls and a small ruby or 2. The latter was a present from her husband when they spent a holiday in Dublin and Killarney in the autumn after they were married. Then she had a lovely dark blue handbag, a gift she got when leaving for Canada, and her suitcase was a large light brown patent leather one with leather and brass fittings, a gift from my husband and I. Mrs. Fullwood says I must write you about these things before it is too late to see about them, as she says my sister's little girlie will value these more than the world when she grows up. She wants the jewelry to pass to a daughter. Elizabeth ended the letter with gratitude to Commissioner Perry from herself and her family. Her father, she said, would yet forgive Wilson if he would tell the truth. In a Prince Albert jail, the prisoner waited what went through his mind as he sat and smoked day after day in that jail cell. Did he hope to get through each day on the hope of hearing from Jesse? Did he wait anxiously for the mail, listen for footsteps, his heart quickening at each approach of the guard? Wilson changed his mind about legal counsel and retained James Hawkins Lindsay of Prince Albert. He may have chosen Lindsay for his name, coincidentally Jack's second name, and the one he signed to some of his love letters to Jesse. One thing was abundantly clear to Wilson. He could not lie his way out of this situation. He likes to lie, he likes to run. He can do neither. His act was indefensible, and the only remote possibility of mercy might come through a plea of insanity. Jack Wilson therefore proceeded to act insane. In a January affidavit, a frustrated James Lindsay stated that his repeated efforts to talk to Wilson's met with failure as a result of Wilson's ill health or his inability to give any intelligent answers to assist in his defense. Wilson was treading God's boards again, but this time they were crumbling beneath him. His absurd behavior, muttering, mumbling, gesturing wildly, refusing to answer questions, succeeded only in making him look ridiculous. So he's trying to act insane, right? Because then he knows he's not going to get killed. He might get some mercy with it. One could argue that he actually is kind of insane at this point in time. So carrying on. So on January 23rd, Lindsay filed a notice of motion to the effect that his client has been unable to give proper instructions for his defense, that he had not sufficient time to prepare the same. The publication of a statement allegedly made by the accused would be prejudicial to him, and that there was an absence of material witnesses. Prosecutors replied with sworn statements from Dr. Oswald Roswell, who treated the Wilson several times while he was in Regina jail, attesting to Wilson's rational behavior. So before this, he was acting a little bit rational, though. And an affidavit from Charles McGregor, the Prince Albert jail, who had spoken with Wilson every day on his incarceration, and who attested to Wilson's completely sane behavior at all times. Upon going to and coming from interviews with his lawyer, he acted completely normal. Though his lawyer complained to McGregor that during those interviews, Wilson gave no sensible answers. Dr. R.L. King, the jail doctor who had Wilson under observation from the time of his incarceration, also gave statements as to his rational behavior at all times. So basically saying, no, he's trying to fake this. Jessie was now 6 months pregnant, at the same stage as Polly Wilson when her life ended. Jessie's pregnancy must have seemed interminable, with the father of her child jailed for murder, and the whole appalling situation uppermost in her mind day and night. James Hawkins Lindsay wrote to Jesse, that's the lawyer of John. So John's lawyer wrote to Jesse asking for any help she could give him. Addresses of credible character witnesses, informing her husband's defense. Jack had told him that Jesse would give him Conrad Reed's address. Jesse answered the letter the same day, agreeing to get the address and do whatever she could to help. But Con and Nell had moved, and she wasn't up to making inquiries through the police. It was all too humiliating. They could surely find out for themselves. Just getting through her days must have been difficult enough without lawyers and police poking and prodding. And what could she tell them that they didn't already know? That she had been cruelly deceived by the man she loved, who she now knew was a murderer? It was almost unbearable. The knowledge that Jack had murdered his wife and orphaned his children in order to be with her. That this woman, pregnant with yet another child, had been living with him in Regina as they planned their marriage. And many times she had driven over the very spot where Polly Wilson lay buried. That, in fact, Jack had made a special point of taking her along when he first went to the culvert with the men from the garage. She was grateful for the support of the family, but knew that people in the town talked of nothing else. What were they saying now? That she knew he still had a wife when she married him, that she knew what had happened by the culvert, maybe even that. And somehow she had to accept the fact that she had loved, perhaps still loved, the man who'd done this loathsome thing. She may have believed Jack's protest that it was an accident. Perhaps she even still believed that Polly Wilson was a bad woman, at least partly at fault for pursuing Jack when he no longer wanted her. She had believed everything else. So her self-esteem is just in the bin. James Lindsay's effort to have a Wilson's trial delayed until May sit-in were unsuccessful. The doctor called to examine Wilson report that he was fit to stand trial, and Lindsay's contention with the newspaper reports of Wilson's alleged confession would damage his prospect of a fair trial fell on deaf ears. The trial was set for February 2nd, and on February 2nd, it would begin. So we'll take our 15-minute break here. All right, so chapter 483, the trial. Even more people than before waited outside the courthouse, but the scenes of the disorder that marked the preliminary hearing did not occur. Potential jurymen, police officers, and witnesses were admitted first. Then, after 12 men were chosen and the charge read. So they found people for the hearing. When the courtroom doors opened to admit the spectators, the sheriff's officers were prepared. They showed preference to the women in the line. When the courtroom filled to overflowing, more than 200 people remained outside. The judge and jury took their places, and the trial of Rex versus John Wilson opened at the Court of the King's Bench. The Chief Justice, Sir Frederick Halton, presided. The presence of a number of mounted police officers, their red tunics in vivid contrast to the khaki of the SPP, provided the courtroom with a dramatic and colorful touch. An item in the Daily Star that day reported that the Royal Northwest Mounted Police and the Dominion Mounted Police had merged under the common title of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP. A ripple went through the crowd as John Wilson was led into the prisoner's box by a jail guard. Wilson was pale and wild-eyed, his cheeks sunken. He had grown a light mustache and his hair needed cutting. Philip E. Mackenzie, KC, was the Crown prosecutor. James Hawkin Lindsley, who is the lawyer, for reasons unknown, did not conduct Wilson's defense. That uneven job fell to A. Murray McIntyre, assisted by Cecil Blackburn. McIntyre opened the proceedings by challenging the jury. In view of the great publicity that has been given to this case, a great deal of which has been unfair to the accused, I would ask your lordship to have the jury challenged for cause. 5 of the jurymen were challenged, and all 5 admitted to have read newspaper reports of the case, but they all swore they had not been influenced by these reports and were ready to give a verdict solely on according to the evidence. 7 others were not challenged, right? So this is why you see a lot of cases get like thrown out. You need a retrial in that, like the jury was flawed. You had your ideal jury member is going to be someone who doesn't know anything. They haven't read the story. They haven't heard about it on the radio. This is such a huge case, though, that everyone's heard about it. During the morning session, Wilson sat with his eyes fixated on the ceiling just above Justice Halton's chair. He scarcely moved, and then only to glance hurriedly at each new witness. Philip Mackenzie opened his preliminary address to the jury. He stressed that serious nature of the case, involvement as it might the life of a fellow creature. He explained murder in the light of the law, differentiating it with other crimes in which death was the result. Then he carefully detailed the facts of the case from the time the defendant was a young man in Scotland. He recounted Wilson's marriage to Polly Hutchinson, his immigration to Canada, enlistment with the Royal Northwest Mounted Police, and falling in love with Jessie Patterson. He told the hushed courtroom that it was Polly's fear for her husband's health that compelled her to make the long journey to Canada to care for him. He detailed their lives up to the time that John Wilson met his wife in the Saskatoon station with a marriage license in his pocket, and he married Jessie Patterson 2 days later. And the parade of witnesses began. Their testimony would take up the first 2 days of the trial. The Crown prosecutor Mackenzie first called Eileen Wismer to the stand. He asked her to tell the court about the Wilson stay at her house, which she did, including Polly's discovery of Jessie's letter and her departure with Saskatoon with $300 pinned to her underclothing. She concluded her testimony by telling of Wilson's late night visit the week after Polly left, his story about the accident near Sutherland, and his asking if Polly had left behind the black purse and necklace. The telegrams signed Polly, and Wilson's letter to Mrs. Wismer about Polly being down with the flu were produced, read by Philip Mackenzie, and entered as exhibits. Miss Wismer said she would scarcely recognize the man in the prisoner's box as John Wilson, who had stayed in her house. The next witness was Mrs. Harry Hansen, who had occupied the room across from the Wilsons and had accompanied Polly to the train when she left for Saskatoon. She had become friendly, and on one occasion, Polly had shown her 2 letters from Jesse Patterson to Jack. The defense strenuously objected to her revealing their contents, since the prosecution could not produce the letters. Chief Justice Halton sustained the objection. Mrs. Halton said she gave Polly a black handbag and gold brooch as going-away gifts. She told the court that although Polly didn't seem very happy to be joining her husband in Saskatoon, she brought a corsage before boarding the train and was excited about having her children with her soon. Wilfred Sales, the Wheatley Jewelry Store, identified marriage license 46645 as the one he sold to an anxious Dominion police officer the morning of Friday, September 27th, in 1918. And yes, he recognized that the accused was that person. Isaac Neufeld testified to Wilson's early morning visit on his farm. He described the burning car, his feelings that there was something funny about the whole thing, as did Isaac Peters and the other threshers, one after another. And Agnes Neufeld, now a full 17 years old, described the spray of blood on the straw suitcase in the back seat and recalled that she asked Wilson what it was. He sort of yanked the valise into the front and told us it was blood from the geese. He seemed mad that we asked. John Neufeld testified that he loaned Wilson a coat for the drive to Blaine Lake and that Wilson had given him a new shovel for which he had no more use for. Alex Armstrong clearly remembered Jack's arrival at the hotel in the forenoon of September 28th, looking like death warmed over. Wilson had gone to the main floor of the washroom, taken his rifle in with him, causing Alex to wonder what he was going to do in there. Under question from the Crown prosecutor, Armstrong recalled that Jack had told him in the summer of 1918 that his wife had died in the old country and that there was quite a story to her death, but he had never heard the story. One after another, they rose and walked to the witness box, each file in a different part of the picture that had begun with such vague, shadowy images. As each new witness testified, the picture became clearer and sharper. Reverend Wiley Clark described the late wedding ceremony in the Presbyterian Manse. Mr. Rindell and Rindell's carriage works detailed Wilson's purchase of a new car, including the trip to the banker and Wilson's subsequent stories when the payments were missed. Jean Brown, Riddle's stenographer, spoke of Wilson's extreme nervousness when he returned with Jesse. Miss Amelia Foster, the newlyweds landlady in Saskatoon, answered questions regarding the Wilsons' arrival, their stay at her house, and their departure for the West. Some of the other witnesses called were James Martin, Charles McLean, Superintendent West, who found Polly's trunks. Sergeant Cathers spoke about the events in Vancouver that opened the investigation to Mary Wilson's disappearance. Detective Sergeant Drysdale, the Royal Northwest Mounted Police, and Inspector Smith of the SPP recounted the exhumation of Polly Wilson's body, which is like digging it up. Sergeant Drysdale identified the photographs he took at the burial sites. They were then added to the other exhibits. Then Dr. Charlton gave the results of his autopsy on Mrs. Mary Wilson's body. Several articles of women's clothing and a lady's boots were examined and identified by Dr. Charlton as those he had removed from the victim's body. After graphically describing the head wound, he produced a vial containing lead pellets that had been taken from the head, and the spectators leaned forward to see better. Mrs. Wilson had been 6 months pregnant with a male child. He had found no money on Mary Wilson's body, but there had been a large safety pin pinned to her underclothing for no obvious reasons. So that's basically used like he searched her body. Assistant Superintendent Tracy testified to find the dispatch case in Wilson's trunk and the almost 100 letters to Jesse Patterson. 100 letters. So like he's writing like 2 or 3 letters a week. The bloodstained dispatch case was displayed and Dr. Charlton testified that the substance staining this case and some of the personal letters inside was human blood. Some of the bloodstained love letters were read by the prosecutor. The courtroom was silent. This was the drama they had all come to hear, right? There's no TV in these days, like stuff like that. Like, so this is just juicy entertainment. On the second day, Wilson seemed much worse. He huddled open-mouthed and wild-eyed in the prisoner's box as one witness after another was sworn in and related another part of the story. He mumbled to himself constantly. When court adjourned for lunch the second day, Wilson stumbled and groped his way along the rail to the jury box. Several times, Chief Justice Halton objected to the length of the Crown's evidence. There is too much atmosphere, he protested. I am sure this is not all essential. The Crown prosecutor promised to endeavor to be more to the point. Sergeant James Cathy, Southey, and Walt Kellen testified. Sergeant W.M. Jennings of the Provincial Police Station at Hatford identified the black person brooch. Mrs. Hanson farewell gifts to Polly as items he received at the Patterson home on Blaine Lake on December 29th, 1919. This disclosure caused a buzz of whispers among the spectators, soon silenced by a look of the judge. When the case for the defense was heard the next day, John Wilson would surely be questioned by the prosecutor about these items and when he had given them to Jesse. So he stole them, stole all his wife's jewelry and gave it to Jesse. Jesse Wilson was listed as a witness for the defense, but she did not appear. 42 witnesses in all told what they knew to that packed courtroom. By the time they were finished, there was no doubt in anyone's mind about what took place at that culvert near Waldheim. The case for the Crown was complete. The picture there for all to see, clear, sharp, and hung up to dry. Those who could not be in the courtroom waited eagerly for the newspaper reports each day, which covered in the trial in great detail. The case for the defense was to begin on the third morning of the trial. Now, so they had 42 witnesses to accuse John Wilson, to testify on his character, which is obviously not good, to, you know, prove details and like all this other stuff. John Wilson had one person who didn't show up. So chapter 44. A professional man. A man who followed the trial from afar with great interest was Arthur Ellis, whose real name was Arthur Bartholomew English. Ellis was a professional hangman, though that was a title he disliked, since he considered himself an artist of the highest order. He hangs people. He called himself the official executioner to the Dominion of Canada, as his artistic discipline was not overcrowded. Ellis presided at most hangings, certainly those of high-profile criminals. Ellis was a mild-looking, dapper Englishman in round, thick-lensed spectacles, who often dressed in a neat suit, tie, and soft fedora. He looked like a kindly district doctor or an avuncular traveling Watkins man with a simple case. But Ellis's black bag was not filled with vanilla or cough syrup or cinnamon for apple pies. It held an assortment of measuring tapes, scales, black hoods, and ropes. Ellis complained quite rightly of unfair treatment. If a hotelman learns I'm in his house, he asks me to vacate it. I am but one cog in the machinery of justice. I am entitled to just as much respect as the justice of the Assize Court. Ellis was a sociable, gregarious man, and it hurt him that others would shun him because of his profession. His mission was to carry out the letter of the law with as little suffering as possible to the condemned man or woman. A professional he certainly was. He could glance at a man and tell his weight within a fraction of a pound. He could also tell how much drop to give him in the rope, how long it would take for his circulatory system to stop functioning after his neck was broken. When he executed the infamous murderer, Henry Wagner, the Flying Dutchman, he shaved 11 seconds off the record time when a condemned man's foot touches the courtyard gravel to when the trap was sprung, just 45 seconds. The previous record was held by his uncle, a hangman in England. It was something of a fetish with him that he asked each condemned person if he or she wanted to make a confession before he carried out the sentence. Arthur Ellis read the newspaper accounts of the Wilson trial with great interest. He expected that his services would soon be required in Saskatchewan. So he's anticipating the death sentence. And for like, this guy's kind of psychotic. He's like, oh my God, I just love hating people. Chapter 45, A Stranger in Strange Land. On the third day, the queue was longer still. The case for the defense would begin, and Wilson himself slated to testify. Defense counsel A.M. McIntyre opened his battle for Wilson's life by introducing the statement Wilson gave in Mary Hutchinson's death was described as a hunting accident. Remember, he pleaded not guilty. Among the chief witnesses for the defense was Conrad Reed. He had worked with John Wilson in 2 police forces, and he had nothing but good things to say about his character and the way he discharged his duties as a police officer. On a cross-examination, he said that on September 26, Wilson had asked him to have the car ready by 4 o'clock the next day, as Wilson was going to Blaine Lake to get married. He planned to be married that evening. Other witnesses for the defense were men who had served in the military police in Regina, including Wilson's superintendent, who readily attested to his dedication to his work and his good character. Officers in the Royal Northwest Mounted Police also testifies to Wilson's good character. William H. Stoddard, who served with Wilson in 1915, said he's always heard that Wilson had a good reputation. G.S. Jobin gave testimony to the good character held by Wilson in the military police, but this is the same man who told Sergeant Drysdale that he thought Wilson was a rum customer. Alex Armsdale from the Blaine Lake Hotel testified that he never had a moment's trouble with Jack, who paid his bills promptly and was pleasant to have around. Miss McIntyre also cross-examined Superintendent Tracy regarding whether Wilson had told him an uncle in Scotland had attempted suicide and died in an insane asylum. Tracy said Wilson had not told him that. This was the first mention of insanity at the trial. The defense also called the police to task for their treatment of Wilson in their efforts to make him confess and to tell where he had buried his wife. In fact, You used third-degree tactics to elicit information from the accused. You put him through the sweatbox, didn't you? We did not, replied Lasonic Tracy. I don't know what a sweatbox is. I never saw one. The moment the spectators were waiting for McIntyre, the moment the spectators were waiting for arrived, McIntyre called John Wilson to the stand. Wilson heard his name called. Trembling violently, he shook his head and refused to get to his feet. When the guard tried to help him out of his chair, Wilson shrank away from him. After a hurried consultation with the lawyers, Chief Justice Halton announced that the prisoner would be taken out of the courtroom and examined by Dr. John A. Valens. Shaken visibly and pointed mutedly to the ceiling, Wilson was led to the courtroom. Presumably, by pointing to the sky, Wilson was invoking God as his witness to his innocence. Back in the holding room, Dr. Valens admitted a sedative to his terrified patient. No one left the courtroom. There were only sounds of whispering and coughing and the scraping of chairs as people turned around to discuss this new development with the person behind. In 10 minutes, the guard arrived with a message from Dr. Valens. John Wilson was in no condition to give evidence at a moment, but the doctor believed he could have him to do so in an hour's time. McIntyre was excused to consult with his client. On his return to the courtroom, McIntyre asked Judge Halton for time to bring his client around. He says his mind is all right, but he is too sick to give evidence, Your Honor, McIntyre said. I am anxious to give you every opportunity to defend your client, said Chief Justice. I realize the difficulties he had to overcome. Halton adjourned court until 2 p.m. When court resumed, McIntyre said he regretted his client was still unable to give evidence counsel had desired him to give. He asked permission to recall Assistant Superintendent Tracy to the stand. He hoped the evidence he had would be forthcoming from the accused. Tracy testified as to the contents of Wilson's second statements, in which he described a hunting accident as the cause of his wife's death and how he had finally decided to bury her under the culvert, fear no one would understand. It also detailed the terror that beset him after the death of his wife and gruesomely described his attempt at suicide. McIntyre then read Wilson's statement very carefully to the jury. He contended that the hunting accidents are very common, so common in fact that the government had passed legislation making it an offense to carry a loaded weapon in a vehicle. He further contended that Wilson's actions were, given the circumstances and his state of panic, believable. He then questioned Bill Tracy again about the insanity in the Wilson's family, but Tracy said he did not remember Wilson telling him about a mentally ill uncle. But I asked him regarding insanity in his uncle, and he said there was some. Philip Mackenzie then rose to ask the witness a question. All the time you saw him, he was rational, wasn't he? He was a most sensible man, more so than a lot of others, replied Tracy. When the defense counsel said he had no more witnesses, Judge Halton asked Prosecutor Mackenzie to address the jury first. McIntyre then attempted to block proceedings by saying there was nothing in evidence to show that the shooting took place in his jurisdiction. The judge said it was too late for that now. Crown Attorney Philip Mackenzie opened with his address to the jury. There are two central points in this case, around the 27th of September 19 and the following November 11th, 1919. The first is the time the alleged crime, and the second is the period when investigations were made leading to the accused arrests. He dwelt on Wilson's relations with Jessie Patterson and the unexpected arrival of Polly Wilson. She came a stranger in a strange land, leaving her two children in Scotland. Wilson's affection had grown cold, and she had tried to win his love back, a love that had been transferred to Jessie. Wilson tried to keep her presence in this country quiet and all the time paid attention to the girl in Blaine Lake. This woman in Regina was a burden on him. He turned down a chief inspectorship in Regina to come to Saskatoon near Jessie. Another thing, Polly was to give birth to a child, making it increasingly difficult for him to continue with Jessie. Instead of telling Polly he could not live with her, he took advantage of the fact that she was his wife and put her in the family way. Seeing that he was about to be burdened with an offspring as well, he formed a definite plan. In a murder case, it is necessary to prove intent. In this case, you have ample opportunity to ascertain intention. There are so many letters bearing on this angle. He wrote to Polly to take the train at a definite time. Why at the same time did he write Jessie telling her he was going out for a marriage license and to secure our rooms in Utana? What was this man's intention? Was he going to marry Jessie? He states in his confession that he had to marry her legally. There were only two ways he could do it legally, through a divorce or through the death of his first wife. It was while Mary was hastening to Saskatoon to meet John Wilson that he was busy at Wheatley's jewelry store getting a license to marry Jessie Patterson, swearing himself to be a bachelor. He met Mary. There's no contradiction to that. Why did he take her into the country? He had a marriage license in his pocket and was on his way to Blaine Lake. Surely he did not want her present at his marriage with Jesse. If the shooting was an accident, Wilson's subsequent actions do not suggest it. He had no grief for the woman who has borne him 2 children. He seeks no medical aid. Instead, he buries her 4 feet underground after a few hours and a few hours after marries Jesse. If the man has lost his wife by accident, out of decency, he would have put off his second nuptials a little while longer. Later, those who knew Mary are led by Wilson to presume she was still alive. Why did he take a post box office at Sutherland? Wasn't it to guard against Jesse finding out he was not a divorced man? At the same time, Wilson told Regina friends that Mary was at Sutherland with influenza, that she was in her grave and he was living with Jesse. Telegrams didn't come from Polly. She was dead. They were signed by Wilson. The prosecutors read numerous letters and telegrams, all written after Mary's death, but written as if she were alive. At one time sick with the flu, convalescent, and then having given birth to a child. Gentlemen, Polly Wilson wasn't ill with a child. She did not give birth to a child. She was not going home. She was dead. Dead by the hand of the man who wrote intimate epistles telling of her progress and recovery. When he rejoined the Royal Northwest Mounted Police in 1919, he gave his wife's name as Mary because that was what he had told them in 1914. Philip Mackenzie rested the case for the Crown. McIntyre next rose to address the jury. His address was understandably briefer, but the Saskatoon Daily Star reported that even that McIntyre, with only slight material with which to work, Wilson's statement that the shooting was an accident, he had put together an admirable defense for Wilson and a plea for acquittal that called forth the admiration of the court. The Chief Justice sincerely thanked McIntyre for the way in which he conducted the case for the accused man. So basically, he'd put up he had the best defense he could get. Then Sir Frederick Halton addressed the jury. Wilson's dealings with Jesse Patterson mark him a scoundrel, but you are not trying him for being a scoundrel. The question is for you to decide whether his wife died as a result of an accident or whether she was murdered, and if Wilson committed the crime. You are not to find Wilson guilty of one thing because he acted like a scoundrel in another. Your indignation is pardonable, but you must not allow it to influence your verdict. The accused is entitled to the benefit of the doubt. The jury retired at 4:30 p.m. on the 3rd day of the trial. In the penultimate crime report on the case made on February 5th, Detective Sergeant Sparkman addressed Wilson's claim that he was too sick to give evidence himself. In contradiction to the latter contention, I beg to state that when the accused was taken to his cell to await the decision of the jury, he lost the vacant stare he wore in the courtroom. He sat on the bed in a quiet, composed manner, took a packet of cigarettes from his right coat pocket, and borrowed a match from the guard to light it. He went on smoking. He then looked up at the guard and said some words to the effect that he guessed the dope worked on him, probably referring to the injection given by Dr. J. Valens. So, again, just for the proof that he's putting on an act. The jury was out less than 2 hours, which is very fast. At the words of the jury's return, the spectators rushed back to the courtroom. Many had never left. John Wilson was led back to the dock, once again adopting the manner he presented in the courtroom. So all of a sudden, now he's coming back. Now he's in this weird shape. At the request of the Chief Justice Halton, the jury foreman stood. And how do you find the prisoner, John Wilson? Guilty or not guilty? Guilty, Your Honor. Sir Frederick turned to Wilson. John Wilson, you have been found guilty of the crime with which you are charged. Have you anything to say why sentence should not be passed upon you? A startling change came over Wilson. He sprang to his feet. Gone was the listless attitude, the dull, roving stare, the expression of imbecility. In a clear voice that could be heard by all parts of the courtroom, he said, "Yes, sir, I wish to protest against me the low-down, dirty methods of the police and taking advantage of my condition of mind and body to obtain information from me." Is that all? Asked the judge. Yes. John Wilson, Judge Halton, the sentence of this court will be that you will be taken from here to Prince Albert Jail, where you will be kept until the 23rd day of April, when you will be taken and hanged by the neck until you are dead, and may God have mercy on your soul. So he is sentenced to death. Wilson was apparently little moved by the death sentence. Sergeant Sparkman accompanied Wilson and the guard to his cell in the courtroom basement, where Wilson at once lay full length on the bed. "Well, John, how do you feel?" the guard asked after a few minutes. "I don't care now." The prisoner ate with apparent appetite his supper of coffee, bread and butter, and canned cherries. Afterwards, he lit a cigarette and smoked with composure. He slept soundly without stirring for nearly 9 hours that night. He was awakened at 5:45 for his breakfast, which he also ate with appetite, walked briskly to the early morning northbound train for his last ride to Prince Albert. On the way down to the station, he volunteered the statement, "Well, my mind's much easier now that I've got my sentence." Is a relief. It's a relief. Is it? It's relief to you, is it, John? Asked the guard. Yes, it feels as a great weight has been lifted off my shoulder. And like, yeah, he slept like a baby for 9 hours, right? So like clearly he's feeling a lot more at ease. His response seemed to imply that he wanted to atone for his crime. This would be in keeping with his statement, "I always thought I would see it through, and with not destroying the evidence that would convict him." At Prince Albert, he was placed in the death cell, where he would receive more consideration than the other prisoners for the last few weeks of his life, 77 days. Superintendent Mahoney sent Polly's family a transcript of the trial and a copy of Wilson's last statement, written in Prince Albert Jail. Elizabeth replied, "Here are some excerpts from her letter written on March 29th, 1920. I feel as though I would never get over it. One thing I know my mother and father will never get over it. It's the awful thought he who professed to love her so much could do such a crude and cruel deed and rob his own little ones of their darling mother. Yet withal, we pity him greatly to think he has brought himself to such a pass. Oh, sir, it's awful to think of his dreadful end and to know he could have been so happy had he done right. If only he had spared her life, she had a pair of the most capable hands and could have worked for herself and her children." His last statement, they're as false as the amount of money he says my sister had when she landed. She would have had at least 100 pounds, if not more. She got a great many presents and money as parting gifts from friends and relatives. We were not aware that Mrs. Hanson had given Polly jewelry as a gift, but Mrs. Lane told mother that Polly had bought a beautiful pendant to send my sister Nellie for Christmas. I note that Jay Patterson gave you some of this jewelry and note you ask us not to wrongly blame her. I can assure you that we don't blame her. We have nothing but pity for her. He has deceived and lied to her and ruined her life, but at the same time, like Wilson's own relations, I think she ought to be thankful for she had a merciful escape. He tired of everybody and everything, and he would have tired of her. He was going to blow his brains out if father refused to give him Polly. Yet see what he has done. Oh, how she loved John Wilson. The worst I have ever heard her say about him was, "Oh, if Jack would only write." We are going to take further advantage of your pro-offered kindness in asking you to send my dear sister's belongings here addressed to my home, but not to send any of the clothes, etc., that she wore when she lost her life. Indeed, sir, I dread the coming of her things, for I helped her pack with oh such prayers and hopes for her future happiness. I accept again our united thanks as a family for your extreme kindness and sympathy to us in our great bereavement, Elizabeth Craig. And so finally, we are in our final chapter. Excuse me. Chapter 46, I did not know what I was doing. We don't know what John Wilson did for those 77 days, what letters he wrote or received, who came to see him, what thoughts occupied his mind. He did not contact any of his or Polly's family or inquire about his children or about who would look after them in the years ahead. So at this point, we are in 1920. Some of his kids they're just about to become teenagers. His first one, probably like 10 or 11 years old. He did not inquire, or there's no record of Jessie having visited him after the verdict, although she may well have done so. On March 1st, he gave yet another indeterminable statement, the one Elizabeth referred to in her letter. This before Sheriff David Seath and the jail warden Giles McGregor. Like the others, it was a rambling account of events since the trouble started in Scotland. It was full of lies about how much money he was sending Polly all along and excuses for not turning in the fines he collected under the Military Service Act. His mind was all to pieces. His head was all gone. He had fits of insanity and so on. On the day of the murder, he makes this admission. About the day of the murder, he makes this admission. I pulled the trigger intentionally, but I did not know what I was doing. She was sitting in the front of the car looking right towards me. I don't know whether I pulled one trigger or two triggers. And this, like, if we go back to like the actual chapter where he did it, like he did, like that's actually kind of true. Like he knew he had to murder her, but like it just kind of happened. Like Polly Wilson knew in that split instant before the blast that her husband was going to kill her. Given the state of Wilson's mind at that time, one can almost grasp what he meant when he said he did it, but he didn't know what he was doing. Wilson recounts his attempts at suicide after he and Jessie were married. He claimed he was not drinking at the time he was in Saskatoon, while several witnesses testified he was drinking heavily. He told of blacking out east of Regina at the Grand Coulee and stopping a car and getting the lift back to the barracks just before the reveal. He told it as proof of insanity, but it sounds very much like an alcoholic blackout. He aired his grievance about the police. They questioned me something terrible about where they would find the body. I would not tell them, and told them I would not tell them until I could see Jessie and tell her myself. And I think it was Goldsmith who put up such an awful story about the body lying out all the time in the cold. Then I told him I would tell him the whole truth about everything if he would keep it out of the newspapers and then transfer me to Prince Albert Jail right away and give me a chance to see Jessie before it went to the newspapers so that I could tell her everything, so that she could write to my people in the old country and tell them everything. Then they took me to Saskatoon and down to some place. And before I knew where I was, they had me confronted with the body to identify the clothing. Next morning, Tracy brought me to Prince Albert, and meantime, they published full details, and Jessie was worse than ever she was. Jack Wilson apparently saw nothing odd in asking Jessie to write to his people and tell them everything. It seemed he has no conception of what a terrible assignment that would be. He also tried to explain what happened to Polly's money and jewelry. One of the witnesses at the trial stated that my wife had $300 pinned inside her dress when she left Regina, but I never knew anything about that and do not believe she had the money. She had about $10 when she arrived in this old country. Some days after 27th December, I found my wife's purse in my pocket, and I must have taken her 2 rings off and put them there along with $3 or $4 and some coppers. One ring got lost, the other ring and the purse and some jewelry in the purse I left undisturbed until the police got it. The other ring was lost. I do not know when or where. They tried to make out I gave it to Jessie, but I did not, as my wife's ring had 5 or 6 stones, and the one Jessie has is only 1 stone. Wilson's signature on his last statement is about half the size of his signature on the marriage license. In Blaine Lake, with her pregnancy almost full term, Jessie waited for April 23rd. The wait was agonized, and she couldn't stop thinking about Jack and his terrible fate. And of course, as the time drew near, it also drew near to the day she would give birth to their child. Each day, those 2 momentous events came closer. Along the natural fears of a first-time mother and one with no husband at her side, she also had to carry the picture of Jack walking to the scaffold and up the steps to his horrible death. A series of letters regarding the return of the 2 trunks, which had been held in evidence at the trial, gave some clue to her feelings. 6 days before the sentence was to be carried out, Wilson signed this request. So this is Wilson's letter. I hereby request that the 4 trunks presently in Saskatoon and which were used as exhibits in my trial be forwarded to my wife, Mrs. John Wilson, at Blaine Lake. 2 of the trunks were Jack and Jessie's. The other 2 were the trunks Polly Wilson packed in Regina, the ones the police found in the express office. He wanted them all sent to Jessie. And so we have a letter here from the officer of the sheriff. This is on April 23rd. Referring to your letter on the 13th, respecting the disposal of 4 trunks containing personal effects which were property of John Wilson. On receipt of your letter, I visited Wilson, but he would give me no instructions until his wife called. His wife did not call to see him, although she promised to do so on Monday or Wednesday this week. As I anticipated something of this nature, I took an order from Wilson authorizing the trunks to be forwarded to Mrs. John Wilson, Blaine Lake. I enclose you the order and presume you will act on his request. The letter was written on the day of his execution, April 23rd, 1920. The clerk of the court sent Jessie a letter on April 26th advising that the trunks would be forwarded at her instruction. She replied, this letter. Your letter at hand today concerning the trunks. I do not want that woman's trunks sent here, no matter what the order was. It will, I think, be easy to tell from the others, as it will likely be labeled from Scotland to Regina and name and etc. You can send it back to where it came from or do anything you like with it. I'll be very glad to get the others as soon as possible. Trusting to receive the above at an early date and thanking you. I remain yours, Mrs. Jessie Wilson. Jessie did not call Mary Wilson by name, but that woman, and her instructions to send it back where it came from or do anything you like with it seems to imply a deep resentment. Jessie's future must have looked very bleak indeed. And keep in mind, so this is 1920s. She is now a single mother. Her name has been everywhere in the courts. Like this is like the Michael Jackson like trial. So like she has realistically at this point in time, like no hopes for a future. She has no skills, nothing. Polly Wilson and the children were not the only victims. So Blaine Lake, this is June 20th, 2020. So this is after the execution. This letter here, I wish to state that I received my 2 trunks from Saskatoon. There were several articles missing besides some valuable papers and letters, which I wish you would return. I wrote to the provincial police about these, and they referred me to you. Besides the paper and letters, with which I must have, as there are some receipts in those I want, there was a gentleman's signet ring of heavy gold with the initial RWK and a gold tier holder and 6 yards of blue silk. Trust in you. You will give this in your prompt attention. I remain yours truly, Mrs. Jessie Wilson. Judging by the sheriff's letter dated April 23rd, John Wilson had waited in vain that last week for a visit from his darling Jessie. So she did not go and see him. So chapter 47, case closed. The Prince Albert jail looked down upon Prince Albert from the top of the end of Central Avenue. At 6:50 a.m. on April 23rd, 1920, the death bell began to toll, momentarily stilling the sparrows celebrating spring in the trees outside the jail. Sheriff Seath and Arthur Ellis entered Wilson's cell, where Wilson was drinking a cup of coffee. He had refused breakfast. Do you wish to make a confession, Jack? Arthur Ellis asked in a kind voice. No. Your time has come, John, Sheriff Seath told him. Wilson put down the cup. Ellis pinioned his hands behind him. His hands kept opening and shutting, the only sign of his nervousness, that and his deathly pallor. Waiting outside the corridor were Charles McGregor, the warden, and Reverend J. McDonald. Although no reporters were allowed in the courtyard, those standing outside that morning must have felt the chill as the bell slowly knelled the procession to the gallows. As a small knot of men in the jail corner turned right towards the courtyard, Wilson's calm faltered. His mouth worked convulsively. He stumbled at his feet, touched the gravel of the courtyard, and the gallows came into view. Standing in the courtyard with hats removed were Dr. P.D. Tyerman and Inspector R.R. Tate. Wilson regained his calm and followed Ellis up the steps. Ellis was the last face Jack Wilson would look upon. So Ellis is that executioner. The hood dropped. At 6:55 a.m., the bell stopped and the black flag rounded the pole. Life was pronounced extinct at 7:07 a.m. The last crime report on the case of Mary Wilson missing was filed by the Saskatchewan Provincial Police that day. Case complete, wrote Sergeant S.H. Kerstruck. In the records of the Department of Vital Statistics for April 23rd, 1920, is registered as the death of John L. Johnson. Also registered on that day is the birth of a son to John Wilson and Mrs. Jessie Wilson. So the son is born the same day that he dies. I won't read this. You're welcome to read this epilogue. The book opened up with Charles Mahoney in 1919. The book ends here with Charles Mahoney as well. It just kind of talks a little bit about this. It talks a little bit about like Elizabeth and stuff, some of the fallout from this. There's also an afterword, which you're welcome to read. You don't have to. The afterword is just the author, how the author stumbled upon this case. This is a true case. They heard about this. They requested the files and they just delved right in there. One thing that is kind of helpful to know, though, I do like talking about is Jessie Patterson. What happened after? We know she had a kid. That was the end of the story. We know. In the afterward, she did marry again. She did bear 6 more children. She had a really full life. She was active in church, music, community affairs, but she went through periods of deep sadness when she withdrew from the family. She died in her 80s. Her eldest son, born 75 years ago today, is still living. At this point in time, he's probably dead. He'd have to be over 100 years old. It feels appropriate to finish this book on the anniversary on the day the real story had ended. And that's just the author, Louis Simi. Yeah. So quite a bit there. So that's the official end of our book. We are going to do some stuff with this next week. I don't think we fully need like a plot summary here. Like the plot summary is like he got interrogated and he went to trial. The whole trial here is just kind of like pointing out, this is what he said, this is the lie. If you're ever unsure about crap, what happened? Like, did he lie about this? There's so many events, there's so many tales, there's so many witnesses and stuff. The trial does a really good job. The chapter in here with the trial does a really good job at laying out, this is what happened, this is why we know the motive was behind it, and this is why it's false. So for the rest of the morning here, you just have time to work on any of your previous assignments. Remember, there is this 3 truths and 3 lies from his statement on page 145 to 48. Remember, the timeline is due on Tuesday. And we are going to look at an essay. We are going to start our first official essay next week on this book. So you will get time here to work on your mission assignments. You're welcome to start thinking about the essay right now, but we'll talk more about that Monday. That's a Monday problem.